Hey guys, tonight we're taking a slow, pigment-dusted stroll through the paint-stained, oil-scented corners of a Renaissance artist's studio, where the work begins long before the first brush touches canvas, and color doesn't simply come from a tube or a tap, but from rocks, bugs, flowers, and a good deal of stubborn grinding. You're going to step softly through the quiet before the creation, past the wooden benches and heavy mortar stones, the dried bundles of herbs, the small linen pouches that crinkle when you touch them, each holding something exotic or dangerous or just plain weird, all in the name of making a color so vivid it looks like it glows. You might think painting starts with inspiration, or with a model lounging by a window. But in truth, it starts with someone crouched over a table, blowing red dust off a tray, sighing deeply, and realizing they're out of rabbit glue again. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, what's your location and local time right now? I read all your sleepy check-ins. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the middle of a Florentine studio sometime around the early 1500s, and no, you're not a famous painter just yet. You're more like the person who gets asked to fetch the smelly fish glue, or sweep the pigment powder off the floor before it clogs someone's sandals again. And while the air might look golden from the shafts of morning light, it smells more like oil, stale egg, and something faintly metallic. Maybe the copper pot still cooling by the window, used earlier to cook down a particularly stubborn red earth into something that might just hold on a brush. The room is cluttered but purposeful. Wooden shelves sag slightly under the weight of jars filled with powders in every shade of earth and fire. Burnt umber, raw sienna, a muddy ochre that looks like it was dug straight from a riverbank, which frankly, it probably was. Near the corner, you spot a grinding table where a young apprentice, barefoot and bleary-eyed, is rotating a heavy glass molar across a flat slab of marble, mixing what looks like powdered charcoal into something oily and slow. His face half covered in a cloth, not because of any workplace regulation, but simply because the dust makes you cough if you breathe too deeply. There's a silence here that feels sacred, not in the religious sense, though saints and angels will inevitably end up on the wall, but in the focused, ritualistic hum of preparation. Nothing is done quickly. Nothing is done twice the same way. If you need a blue, you don't just grab blue. You ask, what kind? Sky blue? Robe of the Virgin blue? The kind that costs as much as a horse, or the kind that stains your hands for 3 days, but fades in 2. And when you do finally decide, the real work begins. You might start with stone, actual, literal stone, like a chunk of lapis lazuli if you're wealthy, or azurite if you're more mortal, and you don't just crush it and call it done. No, you'll need to purify it. That could take days. You'll mix it with wax, knead it with linseed oil, wash it in lye, filter it through cloth, again and again, hoping that what settles at the bottom of the basin is deep and pure enough to justify the effort. Historians still argue whether these early purification methods were more chemical intuition or just glorified superstition. But either way, the results were stunning enough to hang in cathedrals. There's something deeply human, maybe even oddly comforting, in the idea that before painting the divine, someone had to mash bugs and rocks with a stick, stir things with a spoon, and check whether the light in the room was warm enough to test a color's glow. You imagine yourself dipping a fingertip into a freshly mixed pool of pigment. Not to paint, not yet, but just to feel it, like testing dough or soup or wax. And that's when you realize painting in the Renaissance wasn't simply about vision. It was about touch, about knowing when something was too runny or too coarse or too unstable to survive the day. And even then, things didn't always go according to plan. Sometimes your carefully mixed green would crack overnight because the binder wasn't quite right. Sometimes your red would turn brown because the sun hit it while it dried. Sometimes your batch of linseed oil left uncovered for an afternoon would start to smell like old cheese and make your whole studio reek. These were the kinds of disasters no one painted about. Though perhaps they should have. The artist, contrary to modern fantasy, wasn't lounging in inspiration with a wine glass and a swan-feathered smock. They were, more often than not, kneeling on the floor, poking a mixture that wouldn't emulsify, cursing quietly in Latin under their breath, and asking a 12-year-old apprentice whether they'd mistakenly used the turpentine bottle to clean their feet again. In a nearby corner of the room, you spot an old, gnarled book, its pages stiff with splatters and thumbprints. It's not a sketchbook. It's a recipe book. Yes, recipes. For color. Because pigments didn't just magically exist. They were cooked, steeped, distilled, and experimented upon. For a good black, one scroll reads, "Burn vine twigs and let cool under a full moon." Whether this worked better than burning them under a waxing crescent, no one can quite prove. But there it is, written as dogma. Elsewhere a note reads, "Do not trust the Venetian merchant's yellow. It is oft tainted with gypsum and rat droppings." Which honestly feels like advice you could still use at a flea market today. And through it all, you begin to see how color was not just a technical choice. It was a commitment. Choosing a blue meant choosing its source, its binder, its drying time, its symbolism, its cost, and occasionally, whether your studio would smell like fish guts for the next week. It meant deciding whether your patron deserved real ultramarine or just a convincing fake made of powdered glass and hope. It meant explaining to the bishop why his robe had cracked after 2 winters. And no, it was definitely not because you cheaped out on the oil. You take one more look around this crowded, sticky, humming space and realize that you haven't even touched a brush yet. You haven't sketched a single outline, haven't posed a model, haven't stepped foot in the chapel where the fresco will live. All of this, days of work, sweat, sneezing, and strange alchemical muttering, is just preparation. The painting will come later, but for now you're in the part of art history that most people skip over, the part that doesn't hang on museum walls, but lives in the margins, in powder jars, in soot-stained aprons, in oily fingerprints on recipe pages. And yet, this is the part that holds the magic, because somewhere in this clutter, in this quiet, In this endless grinding and filtering and redoing lies the moment when stone becomes spirit, when a bug becomes blood, when a pinch of dried root transforms into something so vivid it can make you weep. You don't see the masterpiece yet, but you see its ingredients. And that's more than enough to begin dreaming. You wake up early the next morning. Well, as early as anyone in a Renaissance workshop wakes when there's still charcoal dust in their eyelashes and a vague smell of boiled linseed oil drifting through the cracks in the shutters, and step barefoot onto a cool stone floor that's seen its fair share of spills, scratches, and perhaps even a few muttered prayers after someone dropped an entire jar of orpiment pigment, which costs roughly the same as a good mule, and has the added bonus of being slightly toxic. The studio is still dim, bathed in that soft pre-dawn grey-blue that makes everything look a little ghostly, and you shuffle quietly past a table cluttered with earthen bowls, crusted with dried paint in layered rings like colorful geological sediment, each bowl labeled in near illegible scroll that only the head painter can decipher without squinting or swearing. Your task this morning, as assigned by the ever-expectant and slightly over-caffeinated master artist, is to fetch a few ingredients from the pigment cellar. Not the kind of cellar with fine wine or dusty relics, but the kind where damp air clings to your tunic, and the shelves are lined with little linen sacks and wooden boxes, all filled with the most mundane-looking substances that somehow hold the power to become divine halos, or flaming martyrdoms under the right brush. The irony, of course, is that before these colors dazzle on a chapel ceiling or shimmer behind a saint's shoulder, they start as rocks, dirt, and things you might otherwise sweep off a road or scrape off your sandals, and you can't help but marvel, quietly, because someone's still asleep upstairs, at the idea that beauty begins so stubbornly, so heavily, so literally earthbound. You find the ochre first. It's the most obedient of pigments. Comes in yellows, reds, browns, depending on how it's cooked or weathered. And unlike its more dramatic cousins, it doesn't smell too weird, doesn't fade too quickly, doesn't try to kill you with arsenic. Just clay and iron oxide, really, ground fine and sifted until it clings to your fingers like flour. The Romans used it. The Etruscans used it. It's the color of dirt after rain, of baked bricks, of well-worn shoes, and saints' sandals, and the shadows beneath buildings at noon. Simple, trustworthy. The kind of pigment you'd write home about if you weren't too tired from grinding it all day. Next is the charcoal black, which is exactly what it sounds like. Burned wood or bones, reduced to powder, almost velvety in texture. The kind of color that doesn't shine but swallows light. Perfect for outlining, shading, or painting the eyes of the penitent. Some artists prefer burnt vine twigs. Others claim peach pits give a richer tone. One recipe even recommends burning almonds soaked in wine, though historians still argue whether that was artistic advice or a culinary accident. Either way, black is always in fashion, though it's rarely the star. It's the quiet foundation, the structure beneath the skin, the night sky before the stars go in. Further down the shelf, your hand brushes a sealed ceramic jar marked with a faded symbol. A sun, maybe, or a badly drawn egg. Inside is white lead, soft and flaky like compressed soap, deadly if you inhale too much of it, which you inevitably do anyway. The apprentices call it angel dust, half in jest, half in warning, because it gives flesh a luminous glow under layers of glaze. But it also has a way of turning your fingers numb if you handle it too long without gloves. Of course, gloves aren't really a thing here. Just dirty rags and hope. You haul the jars upstairs, arms aching slightly, and place them on the mixing bench where an older apprentice is already at work, grinding what looks like burnt sienna with a slow, circular motion that seems almost meditative until you realize he's probably just zoning out from the fumes. He nods without looking up, gestures for the white lead, and continues turning the mullah like a priest blessing a sacred relic. You join him picking up your own slab of marble, laying out the ochre, adding a few drops of water and egg yolk to start the process. The scent is earthy, slightly sour, oddly familiar. You grind in rhythm with your thoughts, which by now have begun to wander, wondering, perhaps, how many hands have repeated this motion over the centuries. How many halos were born from this exact mixture? How many stories began in dirt, and then someone drops a lump of green earth on the floor. It hits with a dull thud, scattering dust into the air, and the room erupts into groans. Not because it's rare, but because cleaning pigment off stone is an art in itself. The green is terre verte, a natural clay colored by iron silicates, beloved for underpainting flesh tones or adding a hint of olive to the hills of Tuscany. It's not bright, not flashy, but reliable. And unlike its more poisonous cousin, verdigris, it won't corrode your canvas or your lungs. Still, some artists insist verdigris gives a glow you can't fake, even if it tries to eat through the wall after a few months. That's the thing about pigments. Many of them are slightly murderous. You just learn to live with it while you're scrubbing the green out of a crack in the flagstone with a damp cloth, and your least favorite sigh. A visiting friar wanders in, probably sent by a patron to check progress, and he pauses by the pigment shelf, squinting at the array like someone trying to choose between potions. He asks casually, why there's so much brown? You blink, not sure how to answer. It's a question no one asks. Brown is everywhere. It's the background of life, the base tone of skin, wood, dirt, shadows, bread crusts, monk robes. It's inescapable. He hums and moves on, leaving you wondering if anyone's ever painted a portrait entirely in brown on purpose, just to prove it could be done. Eventually, the colors begin to come together. Dust to paste, paste to paint, paint to possibility. The palette becomes a circle of earthy little mounds, each with its own personality. Some runny, some thick, some streaked with oil like old soup, and each one labeled in your head by texture rather than name. The red is stubborn today, refuses to mix evenly, clumps at the edges. The yellow behaves, but smells like hay, left too long in the sun. The black is smooth and faithful, never surprises you. You test a few lines on scrap parchment, watching how the pigments dry, how they catch the light, how they resist, or embrace the brush. And still, the rocks remain behind it all. You think again about the raw ingredients, the mines in Spain and Persia, the quarries in the Alps, the dry riverbeds where ochre clings to your boots like a secret. Someone dug these things out of the earth. Someone else carried them on a donkey's back for 3 weeks. Someone else sold them to a merchant who lied about their origin, who sold them to your master, who handed them to you. It's a chain of dust and sweat and suspicion. And somehow, through it all, you're supposed to make beauty. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the beauty is not just in the final image, but in this long, patient alchemy of transforming stone into softness, dirt into light, death into memory. You wipe your hands on your apron, smearing ochre and lead into new patterns that no one will ever frame. You look around at the jars and bowls, the colors born of ground-up earth and ancient heat, and you feel, oddly, content. You haven't painted anything yet, but somehow it feels like you have. There's a soft rhythm to the day now, one that settles into your bones as predictably as the way pigment settles to the bottom of a jar, left untouched, slow, silent, inevitable. And while the senior apprentices start sketching outlines with charcoal on gessoed panels, and the master fusses over commissions and fabric samples, you find yourself drawn to the smallest, quietest scene in the studio. A young boy, perhaps no older than 10, sitting cross-legged near the window, a scrap of discarded wood in his lap, chewing intently on something tucked in the side of his cheek, with that faraway look that children wear when their minds are already somewhere deeper and dreamier than the present moment. At first, you think he's just lost in thought, but then you see it. He's chewing on something thick and stubborn, a piece of dried resin maybe. And at once, the memory of yesterday's mortar work floods back to you, because that smell, faintly sweet, faintly smoky, is unmistakable. He's chewing mastic gum, and in this strange, sleepy Renaissance moment, you realize you're witnessing something that doesn't show up in paintings or letters or lofty artist treatises. Because no one writes down that color mixing starts with mouths, or that some pigments are tasted before they're tested, or that before a brush lifts pigment to panel, sometimes a child chews a sticky lump of dried sap just to soften it enough to be worked into varnish later. And here he is, not as a symbol, not as a metaphor, but as an ordinary apprentice, probably told to prepare the mastic and too impatient to soak it, choosing instead to warm it between his teeth until it reaches just the right elasticity. Something no one teaches, but everyone somehow knows. You sit beside him, and though he doesn't speak, he offers you a piece from the little pouch he keeps tied to his belt, a crumpled corner of cloth holding 2 or 3 yellowish nuggets, like cloudy amber or beads plucked from an old rosary, sticky to the touch and smelling faintly of pine forests and old church incense. You hesitate, then place one on your tongue, expecting bitterness, maybe even pain, but instead you find something strangely comforting, almost floral, with a texture between wax and taffy, something that softens slowly, grudgingly, until your teeth can sink into it like bark yielding to the first spring rain. And as you chew, slowly, thoughtfully, you begin to understand. Not just the gum, but the strange intimacy that comes with preparing color. How it involves the body in full, not just the eyes and hands, but the nose, the skin, even the mouth. You remember that other apprentices chew fish glue when it's too brittle, breathe over shellac to melt it, test the acidity of vinegar by scent alone, and feel the grain of pigments between molars before they trust it on a brush. There's no room for squeamishness here. Color is contact. Color is commitment. And sometimes, color is saliva. The boy shows you how he softens the mastic just enough, then spits it, yes, unceremoniously, into a shell dish, where it will be mixed later with oil or spirits, stirred into varnish, or painted over gold leaf to give it that faint, honeyed glow you see in illuminated manuscripts and altarpieces and halo edges that shimmer like real sunshine. You think of all the times you've stared at religious paintings, admiring the burnished light, never realizing that somewhere behind that glow was a kid chewing resin behind a studio door, hoping the master wouldn't catch him daydreaming. And then the boy asks, in a barely audible whisper, if you've ever chewed on madder root. You blink, unsure how to respond. You've ground madder before, boiled it, strained it through cloth, watched its crimson seep into water like blood from a finger prick. But you've never chewed it. He pulls another cloth bundle from his satchel, unwraps it to reveal a few dry, shriveled root pieces, looking more like withered twigs than anything edible. But he pops one into his mouth like it's the most normal thing in the world. You follow? Because at this point, why not? And the taste hits hard. Earthy, bitter, a little like dried beetroot left too long in a cellar, but with a tang that sticks to the back of your throat. A reminder that this red is alive, or was, once. As you chew, you notice the faintest stain on your tongue, just a blush of color, but unmistakable. And for a moment, you're struck by the simple, ancient magic of it all. This root, pulled from soil, dried by sun, and softened again by your own breath, still holds the power to color flesh. Not symbolically, not metaphorically, but literally. You glance at the boy again, and this time he grins, teeth tinted faint pink like a secret shared. Historians still argue whether this practice, chewing pigments, testing them with tongue and teeth, was widespread, ritualistic, or just something apprentices did out of boredom. There are no formal records, no guild rules mentioning it directly. And yet, enough letters, enough marginal notes, enough whispered accounts in forgotten notebooks suggest that, yes, this was real, real enough to leave behind a taste memory, passed from apprentice to apprentice like a hidden recipe. A code older than books. Later that afternoon, the master calls you over, not for a task, but to show you something. And it's rare enough that you obey quickly, wiping your hands on your apron, cheeks still warm from the madder root. He points to a small wooden panel leaning against a barrel, unremarkable at first glance. Just a single dried layer of gesso with a thin wash of pink brushed across it. But then he lifts it into the light, angles it just so, and suddenly that pale pink glows, not brightly, not gaudily, but with the gentle warmth of skin in candlelight, like the inside of a wrist or the flush of a cheek after laughing. And that, he says, comes from the root you chewed. You nod, struck dumb for a moment, not by the color itself, but by the realization that something so humble, so scratchy and bitter and forgotten, could transform like this. With the right care, the right binder, the right light. The master doesn't wait for praise or questions. He just sets the panel down, turns away, and returns to whatever madness awaits him at his main easel, leaving you to stare a little longer, to run your fingers just above the surface, close enough to feel the warmth, but not to smudge it. Later still, as the studio quiets and the smell of oil and resin thickens like evening fog, you find yourself returning to the corner where the boy sat, now empty except for a folded rag, a bit of dried gum hardened into a crescent shape. You pocket it, not because it's valuable, not because it's beautiful, but because it reminds you that every color here began in a moment like this. Small, strange, a little gross, a little sacred. And as the candles gutter low, and the pigeons begin to murmur on the roof tiles above, you think about how odd it is that something as fleeting as taste, as passing as a root between molars, can still leave behind a color that endures 500 years. The day ends not with fanfare, not with triumph, but with a handful of crushed root, a faint stain on your teeth, and a growing awareness that in this world of Renaissance color, nothing is wasted. Not the bugs, not the dust, not even the things you dare to chew. You're sweeping the studio floor the next morning, half asleep, and hoping no one notices the faint red tint still lingering on your tongue from yesterday's madder experiment. When the door creaks open, and in steps someone you don't recognize. An older man, perhaps a friar or a merchant, dressed in dark robes streaked with dust from the road, his sandals flaking with dried mud, his face hidden behind a long hood until he lifts it just enough to reveal a sunburned nose and a smile that's seen many markets, many deals, and more than a few pigment scams. Without waiting for anyone to acknowledge him, he walks straight to the long table at the back of the studio and carefully, reverently, unties a satchel that, once opened, releases the unmistakable, heady scent of dried citrus, old wood, and something else. Something faintly metallic, like the breath of a cave. No one says a word. Even the master, usually full of muttered commentary or sharp instruction, leans forward in silence, eyes narrowing, watching as the stranger lifts out a small, folded packet of parchment. He unwraps it slowly, layer by delicate layer, until, resting on the final square, there it is. A lump of deep, radiant blue, no larger than a walnut, but glowing in the dim light with a kind of internal life, as if it had been peeled directly from the sky at dusk and left to harden into mineral. This is lapis lazuli, the rarest, richest blue known to the artists of this century, and you realize in that instant, with a curious flutter in your chest, that you're in the presence of something so precious that it could rival gold in value, and yet so humble in appearance that it might be mistaken for a painted stone by anyone less initiated into its secrets. You edge closer, slowly, not wanting to appear too eager, but utterly drawn to the color. Because this blue is not like other blues. It is not the muddy blue of cheap azurite, not the pale blue of faded indigo, not the bluish gray of stormy skies, or the smoky interior of forgotten chapels. This blue is clear, cold, unyielding, the kind of blue that saints wear in heaven and angels guard behind their wings. the kind of blue that does not fade with time but remains as vivid 500 years later as it was the moment it was laid down with a brush dipped in egg yolk and hope. The pigment comes from Afghanistan, from the mines of Badakhshan, deep in the mountains where the stone is hacked from the earth by hand, carried on the backs of donkeys down narrow paths, traded across deserts, passed through hands so numerous and mysterious that by the time it reaches Florence or Venice, no one truly knows who first held it, or what price was paid in blood or silver. Historians still argue whether lapis was ever used in ancient Egypt or whether it only gained fame in the Renaissance. And the debates rage on, footnotes clashing in musty libraries. But none of that matters now. Not when the pigment is here, on the table, in front of you, begging to be transformed. The master offers a single nod, and the merchant carefully divides the stone with a chisel, revealing that dazzling inner core, as fine and luminous as powdered sapphire. Then reseals the rest, tucks it away, and disappears with his payment. A small pouch of coins, so heavy that it clinks even through the layers of cloth. And now, with the studio hushed and expectant, the task falls to the oldest apprentice to begin the process of turning the stone into pigment. A ritual so precise, so maddeningly slow, that it's almost a kind of prayer. First, the stone must be crushed, not too finely, not too coarsely, using a mortar lined with glass beads to avoid contamination. You watch as each strike is deliberate, meditative, and oddly quiet, as if even sound fears to disturb the dignity of this blue. The crushed stone is then mixed with wax and resin into a kind of sticky paste called a caked mass, which is then kneaded repeatedly in lye water, a process that leaches the purest particles of color away from the grit and impurities, leaving behind the finest, most brilliant blue suspended in liquid, which is carefully siphoned off, dried, and stored in tiny porcelain cups, no bigger than thimbles. And for all that effort, for days of grinding, boiling, rinsing, filtering, you might end up with a few grams of usable pigment. That's it. Enough for a few square inches of sky, a single robe, perhaps one perfect halo, which is why ultramarine, as it's called, literally beyond the sea, is reserved for the holiest of figures. The Virgin Mary most often, her cloak painted with a reverence that is financial as much as spiritual. The deeper the blue, the more pious the donor, the more generous the patron, the more sacred the image. And thus, color becomes theology. Pigment becomes proof of faith. Blue becomes divine. There's an old story, perhaps apocryphal, that one of Giotto's assistants once wept after spilling an ounce of ultramarine pigment into the straw-strewn floor, scrubbing his hands raw, trying to retrieve it, only to be gently scolded by the master, who told him that no color is ever truly lost. It merely waits to be found again in another form. Whether it happened or not doesn't matter. What matters is that you believe it could have, because that's the kind of reverence this color demands. The pigment now dry, you are allowed, just for a moment, to dip your brush into it. Only a trace, only a test. And as you pull the line across a small panel, you feel it resist slightly, like silk dragged through water, smooth but firm, and the color that emerges is not just blue, but beyond blue. A blue that makes you pause, makes your breath hitch just a little. makes the entire room seem quieter, more focused, more awake. And then, inevitably, comes the joke. One of the younger apprentices, unable to contain himself, mutters that if they'd only known it was this much trouble, they'd have just crushed blueberries and painted with those. The studio erupts in sleepy laughter. Not because it's especially funny, but because it's true in a way that hurts. And you laugh too, knowing full well that blueberries fade and ultramarine does not. But still, the thought is appealing. Color without cost, beauty without labor, paint without pain. But of course, that's not how this world works. You return the brush to the cup and step back, watching as the master tests the pigment himself, adding a touch of egg yolk, adjusting the thickness, muttering about opacity and saturation, about the way this particular batch seems slightly more violet than usual, though he can't decide if that's good or bad. He dabs it onto the corner of a sketch, just a flourish of blue around an angel's foot. And for a moment, it seems to lift off the page, to hum with an energy that no other color possesses. And later, when the workday ends and the candles are snuffed one by one, you linger near the pigment shelves, staring at the tiny jar of ultramarine, sealed now with wax, labeled in the master's spidery script, tucked behind less valuable colors like burnt umber and iron red. It sits there like a secret, like a relic, like a fragment of the sky that somehow fell to earth and landed in your care. And you think, not for the first time, that if art is memory and color is its language, then ultramarine is the most eloquent of all, speaking not just of saints and skies, but of mountains and mines and the men who dared to bring heaven down into dust. By the time you wander back into the studio the following morning, the air has shifted slightly. Not colder, not warmer, just denser, like the weight of too many secrets is hanging just above your head, pressing gently downward in that way pigment dust always seems to do, even after it's been swept away. And before your feet cross the threshold fully, you catch the unmistakable scent of something floral and spiced, an aroma that instantly calls to mind spice markets, sun-baked fields, and sticky fingers from food stalls. It's saffron, real saffron. Or at least, that's what the boy at the back of the room is claiming, holding up a tiny paper twist between his ink-smudged fingers, grinning like he's just discovered how to turn gold into butter. You step closer, suspicious, because saffron is rare, expensive, and notoriously easy to fake. Substituted with marigold, safflower, even shredded carrot. Anything that can be dried and dyed and sold to the untrained eye. And yet, as he untwists the paper, spilling a few delicate crimson threads onto the table, the color is unmistakable. Not quite red, not quite orange, but something that flickers like firelight across old parchment. Something that catches not just your eye, but your breath. A color so rich, it almost hums. The boy declares that this was his aunt's harvest from last year. The real stuff, he says proudly. From Umbria, which makes the older apprentices roll their eyes behind his back. But no one stops him as he begins steeping the threads in warm water, the way his grandmother supposedly taught him. You watch as the liquid turns slowly, delicately, from clear to yellow to gold, deepening with every passing second until it begins to resemble molten sunlight trapped in a cup. Saffron was used as a dye, a perfume, even a medicine long before anyone thought to mix it into paint. And in the Renaissance, its use in manuscripts and frescoes was both celebrated and feared. Celebrated because nothing else quite matched its brilliance. Feared because nothing faded faster. Artists prized its glow, but cursed its impermanence. And there are stories, perhaps exaggerated, but likely rooted in truth, of whole panels needing to be repainted after a summer sun bleached them to pale straw. Still, when fresh, saffron yellow is unlike anything else. It radiates. It sings. And here, as the boy stirs in a few drops of egg yolk, blending the color into a thick, creamy paste, you understand why painters continue to risk it, despite the cost, the instability, and the rumors of it being cursed by the gods of more reliable pigments. You sit beside him now, watching his awkward, eager movements as he applies the mixture to a small piece of vellum, brushing it in slow, careful strokes. The color glows on the page, catching light in a way that feels theatrical, almost too vivid, too bold for the soft, sleepy world of saints and angels that usually inhabits the master's commissions. It looks almost modern, like something from a dream that hasn't happened yet. But just as you're admiring the color, the master calls from across the room, asking sharply what's being used. When the boy answers, you hear that familiar sigh, the one that blends pride with irritation, like a man watching someone use antique silk to mop up wine. The master walks over, examines the sample, and says nothing for a long time, just stands there, tapping his brush against his wrist, frowning. Then finally, he speaks, not to criticize, not to punish, but to tell a story. He speaks of a painter in Venice who once accepted a commission from a minor nobleman, one of those complicated patrons who demanded extravagance but offered very little coin. The artist, desperate and proud, agreed to render a full family portrait using only the finest and rarest yellows, including saffron. He used it lavishly for the dresses, the cushions, the drapery, even the family dog's collar. And when it was finished, it was stunning, luminous like sunlight frozen in paint. But within months, the color began to fade, slowly but surely, until all that remained were pale outlines and a whisper of what had been. The nobleman, furious, refused to pay the full fee. The artist, shamed, left the city. And the painting, though technically intact, was banished to the back of a chapel, too embarrassing to destroy, too pitiful to display. Historians still argue whether the tale is true or merely apocryphal, but the moral has stuck. Bright things fade, and the brightest, fastest. You glance at the boy beside you, expecting him to wilt under the weight of this story. But instead, he shrugs, scoops up a bit more pigment, and mutters, "Still pretty, though," in a voice that's defiant and honest and impossible not to admire. And you think maybe that's the whole point. Maybe the Renaissance wasn't only about permanence and precision, but also about moments. Brief, vivid, dazzling moments captured in color, even if they vanish after a few decades, even if only the ghosts remain. After all, even the most permanent fresco begins to crack eventually, and what survives is not always what was intended. Later that day, You're tasked with grinding something less romantic, let in yellow, which smells faintly of vinegar and makes your fingers itch. But even as you work, you find yourself glancing back at the saffron scrap the boy left drying on the table. It's already duller than it was that morning, but something of its warmth still lingers, like the memory of sun through stained glass, too quick to photograph, too beautiful to describe. The master says saffron is for fools. The apprentices whisper it's for lovers. You decide quietly that maybe it's for both. But saffron wasn't the only yellow to cause trouble. There was another, the one no one speaks of unless they're trying to scare the new apprentices into wearing gloves. Orpiment, a vivid golden pigment as bright as it is deadly. Derived from arsenic sulfide, it glows like treasure, but crumbles like sin. Beautiful to look at, terrifying to touch. It's said that orpiment, when ground too finely or inhaled too deeply, can make your teeth ache, your fingers tremble, your dreams go dark. And yet artists still used it, because sometimes beauty demands risk. You once saw a jar of orpiment, stored behind 3 others on the highest shelf, sealed with wax, marked with a skull. Not because anyone planned to use it, but because throwing it away seemed more dangerous than keeping it. And the stories about painters who died young, about colorists who coughed blood after months of working in yellow, well, they're told late at night, in candlelight, with a grin and a shiver. And then there's the matter of gambugs, a yellow so transparent and glowing that some compared it to sunlight caught in honey, extracted from tree resin in Southeast Asia, arriving in Europe in brittle sticks wrapped in bark. It smelled sharp, sour, almost citrus-like, and when dissolved, it made a yellow so delicate, so subtle. It was often used in glazes over other colors to create warmth. But it was also a violent purgative. Swallow it, and it empties the body in ways you don't want to imagine. Yet here it is, ground into pigment, transformed into art. You think of all these yellows, fading, dangerous, fragrant, unstable. And it dawns on you that yellow, the color of joy and sunlight and holiness, is also the most deceitful. It tricks the eye. It changes with time. It poisons the careless. It's a color with teeth. And yet artists chased it, loved it, wore it on their brushes like a dare. As the light wanes and the studio begins its slow hush, you clean your tools and look down at your hands, dusted with faint traces of pigment. Nothing dramatic, nothing glowing, just the faint, lingering fingerprints of a day spent chasing color. And even though your fingers ache and your knees are sore, you feel something else too. Something richer, the knowledge that every color here, even the softest yellow, came from labor, from risk, from someone's decision to believe beauty was worth the trouble. And when the last candle is snuffed and the saffron page is tucked into the drying rack, you carry the scent of spice and resin with you into the darkness. A quiet reminder that even the brightest colors begin in shadow. It's sometime in the middle of the week, though days blur when the sun is your only clock, and your routine repeats with such drowsy consistency that even the birds outside seem to chirp in loops. And you find yourself, as usual, elbow-deep in pigment dust. Only this time, it's green. And not just any green. but the kind that smells faintly of vinegar and rust. The kind that stains your skin for days and whispers warnings in the backs of your nostrils, even after you've scrubbed your hands raw with lemon peel and lye soap. Verdigris, the master calls it, the green of ancient copper and slow decay. The color scraped from statues long since buried, then resurrected in bubbling cauldrons, left to sweat in sealed jars until the vapors conjure this strange emerald shimmer that looks like moss kissed by moonlight and curses. Today your task is to stir it, carefully, constantly, without breathing too deeply or blinking too often. As the acidic fumes rise from the mortar, and your head begins to swim in that peculiar way that only certain chemicals can induce. Not quite a dizziness, not quite nausea, but something oddly similar to guilt, as though your body instinctively knows you're meddling with a substance not meant to be invited into your lungs. The thing about green you've come to learn is that despite its abundance in nature, its replication in pigment has always been a kind of cruel trick. Grass is green, leaves are green, frogs and parrots and olives are green. And yet, capturing that color with any permanence was a task that haunted artists across centuries, plagued by instability, toxicity, and the maddening tendency for every green to turn brownish gray the moment you weren't looking. Verdigris is made by suspending copper plates over vinegar in a sealed container, where over days or weeks, depending on the weather, the patience, or the lunar calendar, if you ask the alchemist's apprentice, the metal begins to corrode and blossom into shimmering, flaky crystals, which are then scraped off, ground, and transformed into a paint so vibrant, so liquid in its glow, that even the most cynical master might pause for a breath when it first touches parchment. But this brilliance comes at a price, as most things do in the studio, and verdigris is no exception. Not only does it sicken the lungs and irritate the skin, it also bites into whatever surface it graces, eating away at vellum, weakening canvas, and even causing the paint to crack or discolor if exposed to too much sun or not enough prayer. There are stories, half-whispered, that some churches banned it altogether after murals began weeping green streaks years after their completion, like the ghosts of saints mourning their own decomposition. Still, painters adored it, because in the early hours, when the pigment is fresh and the candlelight catches its translucence just so, it looks alive. It looks like hope, and even though you know it won't last, even though it might crumble, fade, or poison the master if he licks his brush again out of habit, there's something irresistible about it, something that calls to the part of you that still believes art is magic, not science, and that beauty, no matter how fleeting, deserves its moment of glory. Of course, verdigris wasn't the only green in the artist's arsenal. There was malachite too, the mineral cousin, a stone ground into a fine, dusty powder, so soft and smooth, it practically caresses the fingers as it falls through the sieve. It produces a lighter, milkier green, not as jewel-toned as verdigris, but far more stable, less likely to bite back, and easier to store in the cool shadow of the pigment shelves. Some preferred it for landscapes, for grassy meadows and gentle hills, especially when painting miniature scenes in illuminated manuscripts, where the green needed to stay cheerful for centuries, lest the peasants in the margins be doomed to live in withered fields forever. Malachite, though, was harder to find and more expensive, mined in distant lands where the earth cracked open to reveal veins of green, like the breadth of buried forests. Historians still argue whether the Russians supplied the best malachite, or whether the deeper deposits near Sinai produced richer hues, and the debate becomes particularly heated among those who've never touched a paintbrush, but rather hoard dusty books and judge the world by footnotes and surviving samples. You've never held raw malachite, only the powdered kind, stored in small glass jars, labeled in faded ink. And yet, every time you open one, there's that familiar mineral scent, that cool, dry tang that makes your nose twitch, and your mind drift to caverns and cliffs and old mines where pickaxes sang hymns of hunger. The apprentices once dared each other to taste a grain of it, just a single flake, placed on the tongue like a communion wafer. And though no one ever admitted to doing it, you're fairly certain the quietest boy with the ink-stained sleeves knows exactly what it tastes like, because he hasn't stopped coughing since. And then, of course, there was terre-verte, green earth, a pigment so modest, so gentle, it barely qualifies as color. It's dusty, murky, like pond water mixed with clay, the kind of green that doesn't sing, but mumbles. And yet, it was beloved by many, especially for underpainting flesh tones, where its muted coolness tempered the pinks and reds, allowing skin to emerge with softness. With breath, used beneath layers, it disappears, becomes memory rather than pigment. And some say that's what makes it holy. There's a theory, one of many, that early artists used terre-verte because they couldn't afford the brighter greens, that it was a color of poverty and restraint. But others argue that it was a deliberate choice, a stylistic preference, a rejection of gaudiness in favor of subtlety. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between, muddied by time and opinion, and the fact that no one bothered to ask the painters themselves while they were still around to answer. You mix all three greens today, verdigris, malachite, and terre-verte, laying them out side by side in small ceramic shells, adding drops of linseed oil or egg yolk, depending on the master's orders, and watch how each reacts to the binder like a different kind of temperament. One fizzes, one sighs, one sulks. The comparison makes you chuckle quietly, and you whisper their names under your breath like a spell. The poisoner, the prince, the peasant. The panel you're working on is a pastoral scene, some saint or other, walking through fields with a lamb, a child, maybe a strategically placed tree. And the greens will matter. They'll need to layer, to blend, to convince. And as you begin the first strokes, careful not to let the verdigris touch the bare gesso too directly, you marvel again at how something so wild and dangerous can be coaxed into gentleness. If only for a moment. You use the malachite sparingly, just enough for the leaves that catch the sun, and reserve the terre-verte for the shadows, the moss beneath the lamb's hooves, the forgotten corners, where no eye will linger, but every illusion depends. It's a strange kind of joy, this slow coloring of imagined worlds, and even though your back aches and your head still swims faintly from the earlier fumes, you feel oddly content. At one point, the master peers over your shoulder, grunts his approval, and mutters something about the greens behaving today, which you take as the highest of praise. And as he walks away, you allow yourself a small smile, because you know they aren't behaving. Not really. They're just waiting to oxidize, to fade, to crack, waiting to outlast you or betray you, waiting to remind future viewers that beauty is always borrowed, never owned. And maybe that's the point, because when you look at the painting tomorrow, or next year, or 200 years from now, the green may have changed. It may have darkened, melted into brown, or vanished entirely. But the memory of that green, the story behind it, the hands that ground it, mixed it, laid it down in faith, that remains. And that, perhaps, is what makes it worth it. There is a certain hour in the day, usually just after the sun has reached its highest, when the warmth outside begins to seep through the stone walls of the studio, and the air inside grows thick with the scent of sweat, parchment, and pine ash, that even the most enthusiastic apprentice starts to wilt ever so slightly, their eyelids growing heavier, their movements slower, their minds caught between the mechanical repetition of grinding pigment and the vague hum of philosophical questions they'll never have time to answer. It's in that very hour, when the mortar and pestle feel heavier than usual and the colors begin to blur, that the truly sticky work begins. Not the colors themselves, but what holds them, binds them, gives them life on the page or wall or wooden panel. Because no matter how brilliant the pigment, it is nothing without its binder. And in the Renaissance workshop, the options were both beautifully natural and often, let's be honest, a little disgusting. Today, you are not grinding stone or soaking herbs. Today, you are mixing goo. A precise blend of egg yolk and oil, or sap and resin, or whatever else the master deems worthy of suspending centuries of color within its slippery embrace. And there is nothing more intimate or more revolting than learning how each binder behaves, reacts, curdles, or miraculously stabilizes, depending on the weather, the ratio, and the mood of the person mixing it. You begin naturally with egg tempera, the oldest and perhaps most stubborn of them all, beloved for its precision and loathed for its temper. You crack the egg carefully, separating yolk from white in the same way you once saw your grandmother do before baking a cake. Though this time, instead of sugar and flour, you're adding ultramarine dust and a pinch of ground garlic to keep it from spoiling. You roll the yolk gently between your fingers to remove the membrane, a process that leaves your skin slick and slightly shameful, as if you've done something you shouldn't speak of, and drop the golden orb into a ceramic dish, where it quivers like a secret. Once mixed with water and pigment, egg tempera becomes a fast-drying, almost chalky paint, capable of producing astonishing detail, razor-sharp lines, and a finish so matte it absorbs light rather than reflects it. But it requires speed. It requires nerve. It refuses to be overworked, layered, or blended. You must know what you want before you touch the surface, or you will fail. And if you hesitate, just once, the paint dries on the brush, cracks at the stroke, and mocks you with every brittle flake. Then comes oil, linseed, walnut, or poppy seed, depending on the region, the season, and the preference of the artist. Oil is forgiving, oil is luxurious, Oil dries slowly, allows for blending, for corrections, for subtle transitions from shadow to light. But oil is also unruly. It yellows with time, attracts dust, and takes weeks, sometimes months, to fully cure, leaving your work vulnerable to smudges, accidents, and the impatient hands of rich clients who refuse to wait. Linseed oil, pressed from the flax plant, is the most common. It has a warm, slightly nutty smell, and a golden hue that deepens blues, warms reds, and makes everything feel just a bit more alive. But it can wrinkle. It can grow sticky. And if left in a poorly sealed bottle, it can turn rancid, leaving behind a smell that's hard to describe and even harder to forget. Walnut oil is gentler, less prone to yellowing, and often preferred by those painting flesh or fabric. But it's rarer, more expensive, and prone to spoilage if not stored properly. Though, in truth, everything here seems to spoil eventually, given enough time and enough heat. And then there's the fascinating oddity that is gum arabic, a resin collected from the acacia tree, usually in dry, golden tears, that must be dissolved in water and strained before use. Gum arabic is what holds watercolor together. It gives it that subtle transparency, that delicacy, that sense that color is floating rather than resting. It's perfect for manuscripts, for marginalia, for those tiny birds and saints and demons that peek out from the edges of pages, fluttering in hues so soft you're not sure they're even real. But it's not durable. It fears humidity. It curls at the edges. And so, like many things in this workshop, it is both treasured and cursed. You learn to mix these binders not by recipe, but by feel, the way a baker might test dough or a gardener might check soil. Too thin and the pigment runs, too thick and it cracks, too warm and it spoils, too cold and it clumps. Every morning, you perform the same alchemy, adjusting by instinct, by habit, by prayer. And still, there are days when nothing works, when the yolk breaks wrong, or the oil separates, or the gum froths for no reason at all. Today is not one of those days. Today, the egg yolk is cooperative. The oil gleams like sunlight caught in a bottle. The gum dissolves smoothly, without grit or foam. You take this as a blessing, or at least a brief reprieve from the usual frustrations, and you carry your mixtures to the master for inspection, trying not to slosh any of it onto the floor, where last week's Gamboge stain still refuses to fade. The master dips a brush into each binder, tests the flow, the gloss, the resistance, and grunts his approval, his highest form of praise. He gestures for you to begin mixing pigment, and you obey, turning each bowl of sticky liquid into something colorful, something vaguely holy, though no one would admit it aloud. You find that certain combinations produce surprising results. Egg yolk with vermilion creates a red so rich it almost pulses. Walnut oil with azurite makes a blue that glows like twilight. Gum arabic with saffron produces a yellow so delicate you fear even your breath will tarnish it. Historians still argue whether certain painters had secret recipes, passed down like heirlooms, hidden in journals, or disguised as shopping lists. Some believe the most famous works owe their longevity, not to genius, but to perfect proportions of binder and pigment, mixed by apprentices who never received credit, never signed a canvas, but whose fingerprints, metaphorical or otherwise, still linger beneath the varnish. You like to think that's true? that some forgotten girl or boy, hunched over a shell bowl in a dim studio, made the mixture that allowed a saint's robe to remain luminous, or a cherub's cheek to blush softly 5 centuries later. That permanence is not always about boldness, but balance. In the afternoon, you were asked to help prepare a batch of encaustic, a method even older than tempera, involving pigment mixed with hot beeswax and applied while molten. It is terrifying. It is glorious. It smells like honey and smoke. You stir the pot with trembling hands, watching the wax melt and swirl. And when the pigment is added, it blooms like magic, like a spell cast on the very air. But it must be used quickly, before it cools and hardens. It demands teamwork, precision, faith. And as you work, you wonder how much of art is about color, and how much is about what binds it, the invisible, the glue, the compromise. Because binders don't just hold pigment, they determine texture, sheen, transparency. They decide whether a painting breathes or suffocates, whether it lasts or crumbles. You wipe your hands on a rag now, stained yellow and blue and red, a tapestry of mistakes and successes. And as you sit on your stool, watching the light shift on the studio wall, you feel a kind of quiet pride. Not in what you've made, but in what you've learned to hold together, because that's what these binders do. They hold the wild, the chaotic, the beautiful powder that wants to drift away. They make it stay, and maybe, just maybe, that's what you're learning too. There are few sounds more persistent in your daily life than the soft, repetitive scrape of pestle against mortar, that low, rhythmic grinding that becomes almost a form of music when you do it long enough. Less of a task and more of a chant, a sleepy lullaby made of friction and dust, as if the stone itself is whispering old secrets to you, one rotation at a time. And today, as the sun slants through the high windows of the studio and casts golden rectangles on the cracked floor, your hands return to their usual position, gripping the polished wooden handle of a pestle, leaning into the curve of a heavy marble bowl, slowly, patiently reducing a chunk of dried ochre into the finest possible powder your arms can manage. Because before color can be brilliant, before it can be bold or holy or even noticed, it must be ground. And before it can be ground, it must be broken. You begin with chunks, hard, stubborn, irregular stones, sometimes gifted by merchants, sometimes scavenged from riverbeds, sometimes inherited from the previous apprentice who either graduated or disappeared. And you break them into smaller pieces with a hammer, each strike echoing off the walls and making the pigeons nesting in the roof. Beams flutter nervously, as if even they find this part a bit aggressive for an otherwise sleepy studio. Once broken into manageable fragments, you begin the true labor, grinding. Not quickly, never quickly. That only ruins it. Instead, you move the pestle in small circles, coaxing the stone into surrender, watching as it slowly gives up its form, releasing the powder trapped within, particle by particle. It is dusty work, and even with the cloth tied around your nose, your throat itches and your eyes water. But you press on, because the master needs yellow, and yellow begins with this strangely meditative destruction, this patient wearing away. It takes hours, sometimes a full day, just to make enough for one shell dish of pigment. And that's assuming nothing goes wrong. No sudden shift in humidity. No careless sneeze that sends the powder puffing into the air like smoke. No visit from the master's cat, who loves to leap onto your table at the worst possible moment. The other apprentices joke about ghost pigments, the ones you worked so hard to create, but never actually made it to the canvas, lost to spills, wind, or sheer bad luck. You think about that as you keep grinding, your muscles aching in a familiar way, the bowl growing warmer beneath your fingers from the friction. You start to hum, not a tune exactly, but a kind of drawn-out sigh that matches the movement of your hands. The stone gets finer, the color emerges, and slowly the studio around you becomes less of a place and more of a blur, a background to this endless, dusty ritual that defines your days. The other apprentices are at their own tasks, stretching parchment, heating beeswax, arguing over who forgot to clean the shell gold last night. But you stay focused. You like the grinding. It's quiet. It's honest. It doesn't pretend to be anything but what it is. Effort and time and the slow reshaping of something stubborn into something useful. Some colors are harder than others. Azurite, for instance, is so difficult to grind finely without destroying its brilliance that some painters refuse to use it unless absolutely necessary. You've heard tales of artists ruining entire batches by grinding too fast, too hard, turning what should be a vivid blue into a dull gray that no amount of binder can revive. There's even an argument among the apprentices about whether using a copper mortar changes the color outcome, though the master insists that's superstitious rot, and still uses the same wooden-handled pestle his father did, worn smooth at the base like a relic. Then there are colors like red lead, quick to powder, deceptively easy to work with, but also incredibly toxic. You've learned to handle those with caution, to never touch your face, to always clean your tools thoroughly, and to avoid breathing too deeply. Still, you've caught yourself sneezing red before, your fingertips stained, like you've been caught painting roses in a forbidden garden. Historians still argue whether the Renaissance masters knew how dangerous some of these pigments truly were. Some say they didn't care, or that they believed the beauty was worth the risk. Others insist they must have known. The sores, the coughs, the strange dreams. But maybe that's the nature of artists, to ignore what might kill them, if it means the color sings louder, lasts longer. You pause, shake out your hands, roll your shoulders. The powder in the bowl is finally fine enough, the texture smooth as flour, the color a rich, deep yellow that reminds you of old tapestries and dusty manuscripts. You pour it carefully into a glass jar, seal it with wax, label it with the date and your initials. This is your mark, even if no one ever sees it, even if the painting bears the master's name alone. You made this. This color came from your hands. There's a satisfaction in that, a quiet pride that doesn't need applause. You line the jar up with the others on the shelf, red, green, ochre, a tiny bit of cochineal, stored like treasure in a corked vial. The shelves are full of your labor, the invisible hours you've spent turning earth and stone into light. Later, the master calls for a mix of black, and your heart sinks slightly, because that means bone. Bone black, made from charred animal remains, ground into the softest, darkest powder. The smell is distinctive. The process, a little too intimate. Still, it makes a velvety black that mixes well with nearly everything. And once dry, it has a depth that ink can't match. You fetch the jar, open it slowly, trying not to let the scent rush up too fast. It always reminds you of old fires, of something lost. You scoop out a pinch, weigh it with the practiced precision of someone who's been scolded too many times for waste, and carry it to the mixing board. It's strange how much of art is built on destruction. Stones crushed, bones burned, plants boiled, insects dried and ground. Even beauty demands sacrifice. And maybe that's why the act of painting feels so sacred, even when it begins in mess and dust. You remember the first time you saw the master paint with your pigment. It was nothing dramatic, just a sky, a small patch of afternoon blue over the shoulder of a saint. But you recognized it. You knew the exact way that blue had shimmered in the mortar, how it had felt under your pestle. You saw it bloom beneath the brush, and you realized, with a kind of quiet awe, that this was how you lived forever. Not with your name, but with your color. And so you grind, every day, every hour, stones and bones and bugs, dust and dreams. Because in this quiet labor, this endless turning, you're building something bigger than yourself. Something that may hang in a church or hide in a book or crumble after a century of candle smoke. But that, for a while, will catch the light, and that is enough. There's a certain hush in the studio when the subject of recipes comes up. Not cooking recipes, of course, though some of the materials and procedures might fool a newcomer into thinking otherwise. But pigment recipes, those elusive, jealously guarded formulas that pass not from textbook to student, but from master to apprentice, often by whisper, sometimes by accident, and occasionally under threat of punishment if repeated outside the workshop's walls. You've heard murmurs, half-truths, contradictions, and quiet boasts that some colors only truly reveal their radiance when mixed under the right moon, or with water drawn from a specific well, or with the presence of basil leaves in the room to purify the air and keep the pigment from clumping. And while part of you scoffs, the other part, the one that's spent too long trying to recreate a certain shade of green that once shimmered like emerald, but now lies dull and brown, wonders if maybe, just maybe, there's more to it than chemistry. You find yourself drawn to the shelf where the master keeps the oldest pigment books, not illuminated manuscripts or scholarly tomes, but battered leather notebooks, soft with age, filled with hasty, smudged notes, written in Latin, Italian, and sometimes in a code only the master claims to understand. You're not allowed to touch them, of course, but sometimes you stare, just a little too long, pretending to tidy up nearby while your eyes dart over the pages, hoping to catch a glimpse of something profound, an ingredient you've never heard of, a technique that explains why your verdigris always streaks or why your carmine separates no matter how much you grind. You think of Giorgio, a former apprentice long since dismissed. No one says why, but everyone knows it had something to do with a misplaced batch of ultramarine and a particularly angry bishop. Giorgio used to say that good pigment was alchemy, and the true artists knew when to break the rules of science and follow instinct instead. If it smells like rain and stings your eyes, he once told you, while stirring a mixture that looked more like soup than paint. You're probably doing it right. You weren't sure if he was joking. That ambiguity, that mysterious mix of fact, folklore, and flamboyant guesswork is what makes this part of your training both endlessly frustrating and oddly addictive. Because pigments are supposed to be grounded in earth and process and labor. But the more you work with them, the more they seem to behave like living things, moody and unpredictable, responding to changes in weather, light, even your own energy. There are days when the blue flows like silk, when the yellow holds like gold leaf, when the red dries to a perfect blush. And then there are days when everything cracks, clots, or turns the color of spoiled fruit for no discernible reason. Historians still argue whether Renaissance pigment mixing should be considered a proto-science or simply a glorified craft with a splash of dramatic flair. Some treat the notebooks like early chemistry, precursors to systematic study. Others point out the frequent mentions of astrology, saints' days, and dreams as evidence that this was less about formulas and more about faith. But maybe, just maybe, it's both. And that's why it worked. Today, you're asked to help with a particularly troublesome color. Naples yellow. It sounds elegant, like something worn by a wealthy noble lounging in silk robes, but in truth, it's notorious in the studio for being fickle, prone to burning in the kiln if even slightly overheated, and quick to turn chalky if exposed to too much air before mixing. It's also made with lead antimonate, a combination that makes your skin crawl just hearing it. Yet it's so uniquely luminous, with its buttery undertone and subtle warmth, that artists keep returning to it like moths to an uncomfortable but irresistible flame. You handle it with care, measuring with a steady hand, keeping your sleeves rolled back, gloves on, breath held. You mix it slowly, deliberately, trying to coax out that rich, mellow glow without awakening its temper. It takes longer than usual, and the smell isn't pleasant. Somewhere between scorched metal and vinegar. Still, when it's finally ready, when it catches the late morning light just right and seems to hum with a kind of quiet joy, you remember why this process feels so magical, so precarious. The master inspects it, nods slightly, and sets it aside to use in the robes of a minor angel, which is somehow fitting. Heavenly color derived from poisonous earth, as though even the divine needs a bit of danger to shine. There's a whisper among the apprentices that some colors respond to intention, that if you mix a pigment for joy, it will glow brighter, and if you mix it with dread or boredom, it will sulk. You've laughed it off before, but you've also noticed, on those days when your mind drifts, when your hands move mechanically without care, the color lacks something, an energy, a warmth. And then there are the moments, rare and fleeting, when you're fully present, thinking not of lunch or sore fingers, or how long until you're allowed to go home, but only of the color itself, its texture, its shimmer, its potential. And on those days, the pigment comes alive. You don't speak of this aloud. It sounds too much like superstition, like what the old herb women whisper in the market stalls when they sell you dried beetles or rare bark. But still, you wonder if light can be bent through glass, If music can change your mood, then why shouldn't color respond to feeling? You wipe your hands carefully, clean the tools, store the leftover pigment in a jar lined with parchment and sealed with a ribbon of wax. It's a good batch. Maybe even your best. You want to label it with more than just date and type. You want to write, mixed on a calm morning, while the light was soft and the heart was quiet. But that would get you laughed out of the studio. Instead, you press your initials into the wax and tuck the jar among the others, where it will sit until someone needs it. Maybe tomorrow, maybe months from now. Pigments age like people. Some mellow, some spoil, some surprise you. You sit for a moment afterward, sipping water from a clay cup, watching the dust swirl in the sunbeam by the door. A shadow passes. Someone coming in, someone leaving. And you think about all the hands that have passed through this place. All the colors mixed. The saints painted, the patrons pleased or disappointed. And you think, again, of recipes. Not just the ones written down, but the ones remembered in hands and muscle, in instinct and mistake. The secret ingredients aren't just what's in the bowl. They're the sigh you exhale when it works, the frown you wear when it doesn't, the way you learn, little by little, what each color wants. Because color, in the end, is not just something you see. It's something you feel, something you mix with every part of you. And while the world may forget your name, your color might linger, hidden in a fold of painted silk or the halo of a forgotten saint. And isn't that, after all, a kind of legacy? You are still young in your training, still more pigment porter than painter, still more grinder than mixer. And yet, today, for the first time, the master beckons you forward, not to fetch a tool or scrub a board or stir some sour-smelling concoction, but to approach the color wheel, that delicate, sun-faded diagram pinned to the workshop's back wall, so stained with decades of pigment dust and fingerprint grease that it looks more like an abstract painting than a teaching aid. And you feel your breath catch a little, not from awe exactly, but from the sense that something quiet and invisible is about to shift within you. The wheel itself isn't large, perhaps the size of a dinner plate, but its significance in the studio feels enormous, because it holds the logic, the code, the secret alphabet behind every robe, every sky, every saint's eyelid ever painted on the master's panels. And though you've passed it 100 times, carrying jars or sweeping ash, this is the first time you're invited to understand it. Not just look, but see. The master doesn't explain much. He rarely does. Instead, he stands beside you with arms folded, pointing with a piece of broken chalk at a wedge of burnt sienna and saying simply, warm, then pointing at a slice of pale green and saying, cool, before stepping back, as if expecting you to immediately internalize the entire system of chromatic relationships like a revelation from on high. You nod solemnly, though inside your head it's chaos. A swirl of half-remembered thoughts, questions you're not brave enough to ask, and the persistent hum of doubt. What does warm really mean, anyway? In a place where the sunlight is muted by years of candle soot, where the breeze from the open windows is more mildew than fresh. Is it about temperature, emotion, or simply convention? Something that just is. Because enough people agreed it was. Historians still argue whether Renaissance artists, understood color temperature in anything like our modern sense. Some claim they had an intuitive grasp of how to balance hue and value for harmony and depth, while others argue that their decisions were driven less by color theory and more by tradition, symbolism, or even superstition. Either way, you now find yourself squinting at the wheel, trying to decipher what makes one color feel like fire and another like shade. You run your fingers lightly along the edges of the board, smudging a bit of cobalt dust onto your skin. And remember, Giorgio, always Giorgio, with his opinions and mischief, once declaring that the color wheel is just a polite lie. It makes the world seem organized when really it's just pigment chaos with manners. You didn't understand him then. You still don't. But somehow, that feels right. The master gives you a simple task. Mix a flesh tone suitable for the hand of a young woman, pale but not sickly, alive but not ruddy, smooth but not flat. Easy, he says, like asking someone to describe the exact weight of a feather mid-fall. You return to your station, mind still spinning, and begin to stare at the jars. White lead, a little vermilion, maybe some yellow ochre, and a touch of green earth to neutralize the warmth. You start with caution, measuring slowly, unsure. A dab of white, a whisper of red, the yellow reluctant to mix. You grind, stir, tilt the bowl toward the window, frown. Too pink. You add a bit of umber, now too muddy. You try again. This is the dance. A step forward, 2 steps back, a tentative waltz with the invisible logic of the wheel. Each edition changes everything, like a conversation where every word alters the meaning of the last. Eventually you get something that looks plausible. Not perfect, but close. You test it on a scrap of parchment, spreading it with the flat of your finger, and it dries soft, warm, almost breathing. You look at it again after a few minutes and realize, with quiet satisfaction, that it feels like skin, not just in color, but in weight, in temperature, in the way it seems to hold light without shouting for attention. You bring it to the master. He dips a brush into it, dabs it onto the panel he's working on, leans back, squints. Then, with the smallest of nods, he says, "Keep that one." Your chest swells a little. Not with pride, exactly, but with something gentler. Recognition, perhaps, or the thrill of finally being part of the secret conversation between painter and pigment. You label the jar carefully, stashing it beside the others, and wonder if, one day, someone else will open it and try to guess how it was made. Later that evening, after the candles are lit and the apprentices begin cleaning for the night, you find yourself back in front of the wheel. No one else is around. The room smells of linseed and smoke. You trace the arc from blue to green to yellow, pausing at each color as if greeting an old friend. You think of all the saints' robes you've helped outline, of all the halos you've watched being gilded, and you realize how much of painting is not just about placing color on a surface, but understanding how each shade relates to another. How a tiny shift in tone can change a face from peaceful to menacing. How a warm gray can make a sky feel like dusk instead of dawn. You remember the master once saying that painting is the art of pretending light, and you finally begin to understand what he meant. The colors themselves don't glow, the canvas doesn't shine, But with the right arrangement, the right balance, the right warmth in the right place, it feels like sunlight, like breath, like life. And all of that starts not with inspiration, but with the wheel, with this humble, stained circle and your willingness to believe in it. You take a piece of charcoal and sketch your own tiny wheel in the corner of your workbook. Less precise, less complete, but yours. You label it in your own shorthand, mixing real names with invented ones, noting which combinations made you smile, which ones made you want to throw the bowl across the room. You draw arrows, write down questions, invent little theories. It's not science. Not yet. But it's a beginning. Because in the end, the color wheel isn't just a chart. It's a map. A quiet guide through a world made of dust and dreams. And as you grow older, you suspect you'll keep returning to it. Not for answers, but for direction, for grounding, for the strange comfort of knowing that even in a world as chaotic as pigment mixing, there's still a circle you can trust to hold the light. You wake the next day to the faint smell of vinegar and oil, a blend that has soaked into the grain of the workshop's oak beams. And by now, you're convinced even your dreams have begun to carry that same aroma. An invisible perfume of pigment and process that follows you like a quiet, familiar shadow. Today, you're tasked with something that sounds harmless enough, almost silly when said aloud, but you've been around long enough to know better. The master wants you to check the storeroom, take inventory, and more importantly, assess which pigments might be spoiling. At first, you wonder how paint could spoil it all. After all, these are rocks and minerals and bugs, dried and powdered and sealed into jars, not milk left on the hearth or fruit left out in the sun. But as soon as you open the cupboard and the first waft of stale metallic rot hits your nose, you remember very quickly that in this place, nothing stays fresh forever, not even beauty. You begin carefully, starting with the reds. The cochineal, sourced from beetles crushed into crimson dust, seems fine. Its scent faintly sweet and musty like old rose petals. But the vermilion is questionable. The top layer has darkened, and when you stir it, the powder clumps strangely, sticking to the spoon like wet ash. You know better than to inhale too closely. The warnings about mercury-based pigments are recited often in the workshop, not out of concern for safety, necessarily, but more as a precaution against stupidity. The master once said, if it shines like fire and makes your tongue tingle, it's either divine or deadly. Often both. You move on to the greens. Verdigris, made by suspending copper plates over vinegar fumes until they grow a soft blue-green crust, like some botanical disease, is always suspect. The fresh batches shimmer gently, like new leaves after rain, but the older ones crack under pressure, releasing a smell like damp coins. If stored poorly, it can eat through parchment, leather, and even the wood it rests upon. More than once you've seen a sealed jar bubble slightly, as if the pigment were fermenting from within, biding its time like a tiny explosive. And then there's the organic matter. The paints mixed with egg yolk, linseed oil, or gum arabic. Those are the real troublemakers. You find a forgotten dish in the corner, a sad, crusted remnant of what might once have been lead white, now tinged yellow and emitting a sour smell that curls your nose. Mold creeps along the edge in delicate lace patterns, and you scrape it away with a palette knife, wincing at the squelch. Paint, it turns out, is not eternal. It decays. It reacts. It misbehaves. Some colors age gracefully, their tones mellowing like vintage wine. Others turn brittle, fade into grays, or grow a fuzz of corruption overnight. Historians still argue whether Renaissance workshops understood these risks fully, or simply accepted the failures as part of the divine unpredictability of art. Some believe artists deliberately chose unstable pigments to create fleeting beauty, aware that their colors would vanish in decades or centuries, while others suggest they simply didn't have the luxury of knowing or caring what would last beyond the next commission. You pause at a jar of orpiment, a stunning yellow derived from arsenic sulfide. It glows like powdered sunlight, impossibly bright, almost cheerful, until you remember that it is, by every measure, lethally toxic. Its touch can burn. Its dust, if inhaled, can weaken the lungs. And yet, there it sits on the shelf, tucked between the lapis lazuli and the bone black, gleaming innocently, as if unaware of its reputation. Giorgio once joked that orpiment was the workshop's most dangerous flirt. Beautiful, sharp-tongued, and absolutely fatal if embraced too eagerly. You decide not to open it. Instead, you focus on the binders, the egg tempera mixtures especially. They're temperamental, unpredictable, and somehow more alive than anything else in the workshop. A fresh egg must be separated cleanly. No yolk in the white, no white in the yolk. And even then, it must be used within hours, or it begins to thicken, then curdle, then clump into something closer to spoiled custard than art supply. More than once, you've had to explain to the master why your pigments turn streaky, your strokes uneven, only to be told with a sigh that paint is like bread. It rises best when you respect its timing. You also check the oils: walnut, linseed, poppy, each with their own quirks and lifespans. Linseed oil, for instance, darkens with age but dries faster. Walnut oil stays lighter but takes longer to cure. If left too long in a warm cupboard, both can turn rancid. And today, as you lift one of the larger flasks to your nose, you recoil slightly. It has that unmistakable scent, like old kitchen grease, faintly fishy and deeply unpleasant. You make a note to discard it. But what to do with spoiled pigment? You can't simply throw it out. Too much is lost in waste, and pigments, especially the rare ones, are too costly to abandon casually. Some are repurposed, mixed with plaster for ground layers, or used in underpaintings where the decay won't matter as much. Others are dried out, ground again, and tested cautiously. And some are just cursed. The master tells of one jar of black that turned sour every time it touched canvas, no matter who mixed it or how. Eventually, he buried it behind the chapel. You don't know if he was joking. There's a moment during this inventory, halfway through the blues, when you stop, your hands streaked with ochre and your sleeves dusted in green. And you look around at the dozens of little jars, the clinking bottles, the quiet chaos of color, and you realize something. This place is alive. Not in the way a garden is alive, not blooming or breathing, but in the sense that every element here responds to its surroundings, evolves, betrays its origins. Paint is, never just material. It remembers how it was made. It remembers how you treated it. And it turns on you when neglected. You finish your inspection by candlelight, marking your findings on the ledger with slow, steady handwriting. Next to each entry, you write fresh, stable, aging, or in a few unfortunate cases, questionable. You add a note beside one batch of sepia that says, smells like the sea, unsure if that's good or bad. Then you close the book, seal the jars, and blow out the candle. The studio is silent now, save for the creak of the beams and the distant call of nightbirds. You sit for a moment, letting the quiet settle around you, and think again about paint that spoils like cheese, that turns against you like a moody friend, that needs to be coddled and coaxed and sometimes forgiven. Tomorrow you'll mix again. You'll try to recreate a sky or a cloak or the glint in an eye. And you'll do it not with perfect ingredients, but with what survives, with what you've salvaged, revived, or tamed, and that, you think, is its own kind of magic. It's easy to forget, especially when standing in the middle of the studio, surrounded by jars of jewel-like pigment and half-finished panels of angels, martyrs, and mournful Madonnas, that behind every face you've ever seen in a Renaissance painting, every soft cheek, every weary brow, every blushed lip or weathered nose, there was a process, a recipe, a slow, deliberate sequence of layers and decisions, as much craft as it was vision. And always, always, it began with the color that was not quite any color at all. The first approximation of human skin. You're tasked with mixing it today. Not the same flesh tone as last week's saint or last month's cherub, but something entirely new. This time, the face of an old shepherd, weathered, tanned, with creases around the eyes, and the kind of permanent furrow that only comes from a lifetime spent squinting into sun and smoke. And as you look down at your collection of powders, red ochre, lead white, yellow earth, a smudge of bone black, you realize, not for the first time, that creating skin is not about painting what you see, but about building what you feel. Because skin, in painting, is not just one color. It is dozens, maybe hundreds, all layered so finely that no single pigment ever claims dominance. And the final result appears somehow translucent, as if it contains light. The trick is not merely to match a tone, but to give the illusion that blood pulses beneath it, that warmth rises through it, that time has passed across it. And to do that, you must proceed slowly, very slowly, one layer at a time, each thinner than the last, each whispering over the previous like frost forming on glass. You begin with a ground layer, usually something warm and neutral, often a reddish-brown, thinned with oil or egg, brushed on and left to dry until tacky. This underpainting doesn't look like skin, not yet. It looks more like the earth beneath it, like the root color of humanity before light hits it. Then comes the first real pass. A slightly paler mix, perhaps a touch of lead white blended into your base, with a hint of yellow for warmth. You stipple this in gently, barely touching the surface, letting the tone peek through. And then you wait, because drying time is everything. Too fast, and the layers clump. Too slow, and they blend into mud. You watch the paint like a baker watches dough, sensing when it's ready, not by clock or calendar, but by intuition and the occasional gentle poke. Once dry, you add more, a pinker hue along the cheeks and nose, a faint bluish wash under the eyes, where the skin is thinner, almost bruised with realism. You dab in flecks of green where the beard will cast shadow, where veins might lie hidden, and then mute them with a veil of creamy glaze. It feels less like painting and more like tending to a wound. Careful, delicate, patient. Historians still argue whether Renaissance artists followed a strict system for painting flesh tones, some citing manuscripts that outline exact mixtures and sequences, others insisting it was more of a workshop tradition, passed through demonstration and trial than through written formula. What's certain is that the end result was always deeply personal, not just in how it looked, but in how it revealed the painter's understanding of life itself. Skin was the ultimate test. Anyone could paint a robe or a backdrop, or even a hand. But to paint a face, to make it breathe, to make it feel, was something else entirely. You remember Giorgio saying that a poorly painted face could ruin an entire panel, no matter how masterful the rest of it was. You can't hide a bad face, he'd said, squinting at a workshop copy of Saint Jerome that looked, frankly, like a startled turnip. People will forgive a lazy tree or an awkward hand, but a face they remember. And so you labor, not just over tones and brushes, but over stories. Because this shepherd, this painted fiction, needs more than accurate skin. He needs a life. He needs fatigue in the eyes, a hint of sun-darkened lips, of weariness at the temples. You do this not with bold strokes, but with glazes, thin, translucent veils of pigment suspended in oil, brushed on so lightly they seem to vanish. And yet they build. They build like time itself. In the mix room, you find an old bottle of poppy oil, smoother and paler than linseed, perfect for blending. You combine it with a wash of madder root, just a touch, and apply it as a blush across the cheeks. Then a dab of bone black, so faint it's more suggestion than shade, beneath the chin and in the corners of the mouth. You stand back and squint, then lean in and add a dot of white to the inner eye. A trick you learned watching the master when he thought no one was looking. Suddenly, the shepherd's eyes shift. Not really, not in any measurable way, but in spirit. He looks tired. He looks alive. Later, as the workshop quiets and the day turns gold, you sit beside your work and try not to stare at it too long. The temptation to fix is strong, but you've learned that overworking is just another word for destruction. The face is close now. Not perfect. Never perfect, but close enough that it might pass into the world without shame. You flip through your sketchbook, past pages of noses and ears, chins and brows, all shaded in graphite and chalk. And you wonder how many faces you'll paint before you stop being afraid of them. Because they are terrifying in a way. Not just because of the technical skill they demand, but because they are always watching, always judged. And in some strange sense, always reflecting something back at you. Your mistakes, your intentions, your humanity. You pack away your tools, clean your brushes in silence, and glance once more at the pigment jars. There is still so much to learn, so many combinations to try, so many shades of pink and brown and ochre and grey that might one day become a saint or a beggar, or a face no one knows, but everyone recognizes. The workshop smells of turpentine and dust. Outside, someone is singing a tune you half remember. You pause by the door, the shepherd's face still behind your eyes, and think, skin is never just surface. It is memory. It is hope. It is failure. And it is always, always earned, layer by careful layer. The following morning arrives quietly, wrapped in a mist so fine and still that even the rooftops appear softened, as though some unseen hand has gently smudged the edges of the town. And in this muted air, you walk slowly toward the chapel down the road. Not because there's a mass or a sermon to attend, but because today you're tasked with an observation, a quiet study, not of doctrine or devotion, but of color. Specifically, the curious way the Church has chosen, with meticulous consistency and centuries of tradition, to assign specific colors to specific saints, robes, halos, and holy gestures, so that even a child, barely able to read a scroll, might look at a panel painting and say, "Ah, yes, that one is St. Peter. He wears the deep sea blue. Or that must be Mary. Look at her robes, the color of lapis. That's how we know." Inside, the scent of incense still lingers in the rafters, but the place is otherwise empty, quiet, but not silent, filled with the faint creaks of old wood settling, and a few high-pitched chirps from hidden sparrows tucked into the beams. You take a seat on the worn bench just in front of a faded fresco, one of those large wall-sized pieces that has surrendered much of its detail to time and smoke, but still holds enough color to let you guess its subject. A martyr, perhaps, judging by the palm frond and slightly grim expression. And there it is. The deep red of the cloak, still visible even after centuries, signaling not just blood, but sacrifice, courage, and divine suffering. Color in religious painting, you realize, is not merely aesthetic. It is symbolic, codified, and occasionally enforced by clerical decree. Red is for passion and martyrdom, blue for purity and the divine, white for innocence, green for hope, gold for glory, black for mourning. And while each artist may mix their pigments differently, may layer more or less glaze or substitute cheaper alternatives, the core associations remain strangely rigid, like unwritten rules everyone agrees on without quite remembering who first set them. Historians still argue whether these color codes emerged organically, through centuries of visual tradition and repetition, or whether they were consciously designed by the Church as part of a broader effort to make religious art accessible, understandable, and authoritative to an illiterate population. Some suggest that early church councils deliberately promoted certain color schemes to reinforce theological teachings, while others believe artists simply borrowed from existing Roman and Byzantine traditions, gradually solidifying them through common use. But whether by design or evolution, the result is the same. Color becomes a language, and the paintings speak it fluently. Take, for example, the Virgin Mary. She's almost always clad in blue, not the cheerful cornflower blue of a child's drawing, but a deep, solemn ultramarine. made from the pulverized remains of lapis lazuli, that impossibly rare stone hauled at great cost from the mines of Afghanistan to the hands of Phoenician merchants, then ground in secret with wax and resin and oil until it turned into a pigment so prized that patrons would specify in their contracts just how much was to be used and where. Ultramarine was not just beautiful. It was a status symbol, a financial sacrifice, a declaration that the figure it adorned was worthy of the rarest materials on earth. And so Mary, Queen of Heaven, bore it proudly in nearly every major panel, her robes glowing even when the rest of the scene remained subdued. It's said that some churches ran out of funds trying to supply enough lapis for a single altarpiece, while others substituted azurite, a more common mineral that sadly darkened with age to a murky green. The result? A Virgin Mary that, centuries later, appeared as if she were wearing moss instead of sky. You glance around the chapel and see more of these decisions. A St. John in dusty red, a Christ figure in radiant white edged with gold leaf, and somewhere near the rear altar, the vague outline of a saint, possibly Catherine, wearing the soft yellow traditionally reserved for wisdom and divinely inspired intellect. And yet, not all colors are so clear-cut. Green, for example, can mean rebirth in one context and decay in another. Black can suggest death, but also solemnity. Purple, once reserved for imperial authority, became associated with penance and suffering. It's like walking through a forest where every leaf has been painted with intent. But you're never quite sure if the meaning is rooted in theology or simply in fashion. In your own workshop, the master keeps a small folio of color swatches, tiny rectangles of dried pigment on vellum, annotated with notes like Mary's robe, panel for Santa Lucia, 1482, or Blood of Stephen, toned with charcoal glaze. These references are part of the studio's visual grammar, handed down like recipes, not to dictate style, but to maintain the quiet continuity of the sacred visual language. You're told to consult them often, not because the exact shade matters so much, but because the feeling does. You remember once trying to paint a Saint Sebastian with a bluish tint to his wounds, just a touch to suggest bruising beneath the skin. And the master had frowned, not because it was anatomically incorrect, but because suffering must feel warm, not cold. That sentence lingered with you. Suffering must feel warm. So you mixed again, added a trace of vermilion, and the painting changed. Slightly, subtly, just enough to make the blood feel like it had come from within. Later, when discussing commissions with patrons, the color conversations become negotiations. A wealthy widow might request extra gold leaf for her family's chapel painting. Not for ostentation, she insists, but to reflect divine light. A merchant might ask for the robes of the Magi to be painted in exotic hues, reflecting his own trade connections. Sometimes, colors are added not for theology or symbolism, but for vanity. And you, as the painter's assistant, must balance these whims with the established canon, tiptoeing between reverence and commerce. And then there are the unspoken colors, the ones that don't appear often, or when they do, seem to whisper rather than shout. A faint violet in the corner of a morning scene, a dull grey glaze over a crucifixion sky, a greenish tint to the robes of a figure no one can quite name. These colors aren't prescribed. They don't carry a clear message. They just exist. Course of feeling, echoes of decisions that may have made sense to the artist in the moment, but now drift through time without annotation. You leave the chapel feeling slightly overwhelmed, but also strangely calm. It's comforting in a way to know that even amidst all the chaos of commissions and egos and spoiled pigment, there exists this quiet agreement that certain colors mean certain things. That the sky behind Mary should shimmer with blue, that blood must burn red, that gold still means glory. And as you walk back to the workshop, with the sun climbing higher and the dew evaporating from the cobblestones, you begin to think about the painting waiting on your easel, the shepherd's face nearly complete, his cloak still bare. And you consider which color would speak best for him. Not the brightest, not the rarest, just the one that makes him feel real. Because in the end, color is not just what the eye sees, it's what the heart remembers. As the days drift onward and your fingers grow more familiar with the shape of each pigment jar, its weight, its tendency to clump or scatter or glisten, you begin to sense that among all the colors in your palette, none holds more reverence, more expectation, and, ironically, more capacity for misfortune than that somber, sacred, and deceptively noble shade we simply call blue. Though to call it that is to flatten an entire world of meaning, cost, and quiet desperation into a single syllable that barely scratches the surface of what this color has demanded from artists, patrons, and the very stones of the earth. Blue, in the Renaissance world, is not merely a color. It is an aspiration, a divine proxy, a status symbol so absurdly precious that its use is often restricted, not by artistic choice, but by financial decree, with contracts stipulating exactly how many square inches of ultramarine must be used for the Virgin's robe, how finely it must be ground, and, most tellingly, how far down the priority list payment to the artist will fall if even a single flake of it appears to have been skimped or substituted. Which is to say, yes, blue meant holiness, but it also meant you, the artist, might end up bankrupt, indebted, or quietly selling leftover pigment behind your master's back just to afford supper. It all begins with a rock. Not just any rock, of course, but the deep blue, gold-flecked marvel known as lapis lazuli, mined primarily in a region of northeastern Afghanistan, so remote and so jealously guarded that caravans would often return months late or not at all, bearing stories of treacherous mountain paths, bandit raids, or trade disputes that left crates of precious stone languishing in some distant fortress. When the stones did arrive, they were sold at obscene prices in Venice, where they were passed to color merchants, men whose job was not only to acquire pigment, but to understand how to coax its essence from stubborn mineral form into something that could flow across wood panels like liquid sapphire. The process, which you have only witnessed once and never dared replicate, involves grinding the lapis to a fine dust, mixing it with wax, resins, oils, and lye, then kneading the mixture in water like dough until, by some mysterious act of patience and alchemical artistry, the true blue emerges, ultramarine, beyond the sea. A name that still feels more like a legend than a pigment, as if it were plucked from the horizon itself and wrung into existence by the sheer will of longing. Once in your hands, it is both a blessing and a burden. You hold a pinch of it now, no larger than a thumbnail, worth more than a week of your wages, and you tremble, not with fear exactly, but with the cold awareness that one misstep, too much oil, a careless brushstroke, an unexpected crack in the panel, might waste it entirely. Your master watches as you prepare the mix, saying nothing, but you feel his gaze the way one feels a knife sheathed just behind the ribs when the color finally spreads across the primed surface. A virgin's mantle, still faceless, her hands not yet drawn. It glows, not with brightness, but with depth, as though it opens onto some other world, some unreachable sphere of stillness. And you understand, if only for a moment, why blue came to mean not just beauty, but divinity. Historians still argue whether this association between ultramarine and the Virgin Mary was theological, aesthetic, or simply a matter of economic logic. If the most expensive color was reserved for the holiest figure, as an act of visual devotion, or as a marketing ploy to impress wealthy patrons who could brag that their Madonna cost twice as much, because just look at her robe. But regardless of the motive, the effect was the same. Blue became sacred, and with it came 1,000 quiet panics. You've heard tales from other workshops of apprentices being beaten for spilling a jar, of artists selling furniture to afford a handful more, of negotiations so tense that contracts included absurd clauses like, if the ultramarine fails to shine when dry, the artist must repaint at his own expense, even if he has died. In one particularly legendary case, an artist reportedly painted the entire Virgin in grisaille, shades of grey, leaving the robe blank until the patron could afford more pigment, and the half-finished painting hung in a chapel for 6 years, with nothing but a charcoal outline draped across her shoulders, like a promise unfulfilled. And then, of course, came the substitutes. Azurite, the poor man's ultramarine, was abundant and easy to work with, but its cheerful hue lacked the depth, the almost melancholic weight of lapis. And worse, it tended to degrade over time into a greenish sludge, which meant that more than one would-be holy figure has spent eternity looking not divine, but a bit seasick. Some artists tried blending azurite with black to darken it. Others layered it over a warm underpainting to fake richness. And a few more desperate souls turned to indigo or smalt, or even blue glass ground into powder, each one cheaper, duller, and more prone to the judgmental eyes of future restorers who would surely mutter, "He couldn't afford the good stuff, poor fellow." And yet, for all its drama, for all the ruined panels and nervous apprentices and blistering debates over purity, blue retains its throne, not just in art, but in the soul of the viewer. There is something about it, about the way ultramarine seems to absorb the surrounding light and then return it as something cooler, quieter, more eternal, that makes people stop, even now, and linger. It doesn't demand attention like red, or gleam like gold, or comfort like warm earth tones. Instead, it waits, patient, confident, and deep. It is the color of silence, of longing, of skies we can never quite reach. And for that reason, it endures. You walk past a finished panel in the corner of the studio, a Madonna and Child, completed months ago, but not yet collected by the patron. and you stop to study the folds of her robe. You know exactly how they were painted. The underlayer of duller blue, the slow build-up of ultramarine in transparent glazes, the subtle edging with pale gray to suggest reflection, the faint dusting of real gold at the hem. And yet, even knowing all this, you still find yourself drawn into it, as if the robe were not paint, but fabric, not mineral, but mercy. You recall the first time you mixed ultramarine, your hands shaking, your brush slipping slightly, leaving a streak across the panel. You had apologized aloud, though no one else was in the room. And you remember thinking, not entirely joking, that perhaps the color would forgive you, that something so beautiful could not possibly hold a grudge. Now, as you prepare for the next painting, a commission for a local merchant who insists on a virgin as blue as the heavens and not a coin less, you carefully measure out your pigment, feeling the familiar knot of anxiety rising in your chest. But it is tempered now by something else, something like reverence, or perhaps stubbornness. You know the risks, you know the expectations. You know that when you paint with ultramarine, you are not merely painting, you are entering a conversation that has spanned continents and centuries, a dialogue between stone and story, money and mystery, theology and technique. And still, you dip your brush as the afternoon sun filters through the workshop's narrow windows, casting long, slanted rectangles of light across your workspace. You turn your attention to something that, at first glance, seems almost mundane. A shallow wooden box filled with flakes, crumbs, and specks of something that glitters faintly in the light, though not like gemstone or powdered lapis, but with a dull, stubborn shimmer of something once regal and now almost humble. Gold, or rather, things meant to resemble gold, things that fool the eye for just long enough to suggest opulence, only to reveal, upon closer examination, a story not of wealth, but of ingenuity, deception, and the Renaissance artist's complicated relationship with the concept of brilliance itself. You lift a fragment with the tip of a brush handle and hold it up to the light, watching how it catches, not like sunlight on water, but more like a dusty memory of what light used to look like on wealth. This, you know, is not true gold leaf, though it has served the role, convincingly enough, in minor commissions, decorative borders, and quick altar panels for parishes too poor or too frugal to pay for actual gilding. This is powdered brass, sometimes called Dutch metal, a blend of copper and zinc that tarnishes quickly, flakes under varnish, and has a tendency to green with age, giving once luminous halos the uncomfortable shade of aging olives. And yet it's used, frequently, repeatedly, sometimes even by choice rather than necessity. The story of gold in painting is not merely a tale of luxury. It's a tale of technique, illusion, symbolism, and perhaps, most surprisingly, compromise. Because while pure gold leaf, a substance so thin that a single breath could send it fluttering across the studio, remains the standard of holiness in the gilded backgrounds of icons, altarpieces, and illuminated manuscripts. Not every commission calls for the divine radiance of hammered aurum. Sometimes the client just wants something that looks impressive without being expensive. Sometimes the artists simply can't afford the materials required to match the expectations of a heavenly glow. So they turn to shell gold. Shell gold, contrary to its luxurious name, is a humble creation. A paste made by grinding genuine gold leaf with a bit of honey or gum arabic and storing it in an empty seashell, hence the name, though sometimes a small clay dish is used instead. The result is a brushable form of gold, soft and subtle, ideal for fine lines, halos, details on robes, or the delicate accents that shimmer faintly when the light is just right. It doesn't gleam like leaf gold, it doesn't flash, but it whispers, glows gently, and is forgiving to apply, which, for many artists, is worth more than brilliance. And there is mosaic gold, which isn't gold at all, but a sulphurous compound of tin, known for its bright, fake sparkle and its tendency to smell faintly of rotten eggs. Mosaic gold was popular in certain regions precisely because it fooled the untrained eye. It could be used in manuscript borders or faux frames, where the viewer was never close enough to inspect the texture or pick up the scent. And even today, restorers sometimes grimace when they lift a panel and catch that lingering odor of trickery. Historians still argue whether the use of false golds, shell, mosaic, Dutch metal, was always a sign of economic limitation, or, in some cases, a deliberate aesthetic choice. Some scholars suggest that the softer glow of shell gold better suited the quiet humility of certain religious scenes, especially those depicting the Passion or saints in exile, while others argue that the primary concern was always financial, and that any defense of subtlety was just a convenient justification offered after the fact. In truth, it's likely both are true. Artists, ever adaptable, found meaning in their limitations and turned necessity into expression. You remember a time early in your apprenticeship when you were tasked with laying gold leaf for the border of a small devotional panel, a commission from a wealthy widow who insisted on a gilded frame, like the ones in Florence, but brighter. The master had warned you to breathe gently, to keep the window closed, and to move slowly, like a priest handling relics. You had trembled as you opened the waxed envelope containing the leaves, each one thinner than a whisper, nearly invisible until it caught the light. Using the gilder's tip, a flat, delicate brush, you lifted a square and laid it gently onto the bowl, the red clay underlayer that gives gold leaf its warmth. It clung, rippled slightly, and settled. And in that moment, you felt not like an artist, but like a magician. But the magic fades quickly when you run out of supplies halfway through the border, and the remaining leaf is too torn to use. The master, unbothered, hands you a shell of gold paste and instructs you to finish the corners with this. It won't catch the candlelight the same way, but she won't notice. And indeed, when the widow came to inspect the piece, she wept at its beauty, thanked the Virgin aloud, and offered a generous tip, entirely unaware that her border was 2 parts glory, 1 part compromise. This, you now understand, is the strange truth of gold in Renaissance art. Its value lies not just in its substance, but in the belief that it is present. If the eye believes, the soul follows. And yet true gold still has its moments. Walk into any cathedral, and you will find at least one panel, often high above the altar, where the background is a sheet of uninterrupted gold leaf. No landscape, no sky, just gold, against which the saints stand as though illuminated from within. These backgrounds, inherited from Byzantine tradition, don't represent space or time, but eternity. They say, this figure exists beyond your world, and because the gold reflects light directly, the painting shifts as you move, creating a living halo around the still image. It's a kind of optical theology. Divine figures exist outside of shadow. Of course, applying gold leaf at that scale is no easy feat. It involves burnishing tools, breath control, perfect timing, and occasionally quiet sobbing when a breeze from an open door scatters the leaf across the studio floor like golden confetti from a wedding you weren't invited to. You've seen the master lose an entire morning's work that way, chasing squares of gold like autumn leaves, muttering words that the saints would not approve of. And still, artists persisted, because despite its fragility, despite the cost, despite the risk of tarnish or theft or rejection by a patron who wanted more blue and less shine, gold remained essential, not just as a material, but as an idea. It wasn't about wealth. It was about transcendence. A painted panel might warp, darken, crack, and fade, but the gold, true gold, would endure, catching the light of 1,000 candles over 100 years, and still returning it, still whispering its subtle, sacred warmth to whoever stood in front of it. You place the powdered brass back in its drawer, gently, and clean the shallow dish where you've been mixing shell gold for the border of your current panel. You know it won't shimmer quite like leaf, but the lines will hold, the glow will remain, and the illusion will serve its purpose, because in this quiet world of pigments, binders, and brushstrokes, sometimes fool's gold is enough, especially if it helps one more viewer feel, if only for a moment, that they've glimpsed something holy. And yet, for all the shimmering victories and solemn flourishes of color that adorn altar panels and sacred portraits, for every Madonna draped in impossible blue, or every saint's halo burnished to a golden gleam, there exists, hidden behind closed doors and unswept corners of workshops, a quieter, more familiar truth, one far more relatable to your weary hands and your imperfect efforts at daily mixing. And that truth is this: even the greatest artists, those whose names echo through time like church bells in a forgotten valley, sometimes made absolute, irredeemable, unforgivable mud. Yes, mud. Not the earthy pigment from riverbanks that was prized for grounding a composition, but the accidental, soul-crushing, enthusiasm-killing sludge that results when one mixes colors with too much optimism and not nearly enough understanding of how they interact. A sort of ugly, grayish brown that seems to mock you as it dries, whispering, "You thought you understood color theory, didn't you? And you are not alone." Even the masters, those whose frescoes stretch across vaulted ceilings, whose brushwork has been dissected by scholars and imitated by generations, have had their moments of frustration, of layering one glaze too many, or attempting a bold hue combination that, once dry, looked more like bruised fruit than divine radiance. In fact, buried beneath many celebrated paintings are ghosts of earlier mistakes. Entire figures painted over, skies repainted in haste, or robes glazed again and again in a desperate attempt to mask a hue that just didn't work. It's a humbling thought, really, that Michelangelo, who could sculpt marble into muscled saints and paint a universe onto a chapel ceiling, once stormed away from a panel muttering about green shadows that had gone too blue. Historians still argue whether Leonardo da Vinci's famed experimentation with glazes was an act of perfectionism or a series of persistent color failures masked by his endless retouching. There's even a surviving letter in which Raphael complains about a shipment of vermilion that refuses to remain red, as if the pigment itself were staging a mutiny. You remember your own first disaster vividly. A planned portrait of Saint Lucy, meant to glow with soft oranges and deep violets, that somehow ended up looking like she'd been caught in a dust storm at dusk. You had followed the recipe exactly, or so you thought, mixing madder lake with a touch of white for the skin tones, overlaying it with a faint blush of vermilion, and attempting to bring depth with a hint of green-gray in the shadows. But something went wrong, something subtle and irreversible, and what emerged wasn't divine or even human, but oddly vegetal. She looked like a saint carved from a turnip. The master had stared for a long moment, sighed, and said only, "Scrape it." You scraped, slowly, carefully, quietly. And as you did, you swore, as every apprentice does at some point, that you would never again trust a pigment without first testing it a dozen times. The tragedy, of course, is that mixing colors is never an exact science. Not then, and not even now. Pigments behave differently depending on their source, the medium, the humidity in the room, the surface beneath, and the drying time. Even two jars labeled identically, say, ochre from Sienna, can vary wildly if one was stored in damp conditions or ground a bit too fine. Add to that the problem of glazing, where transparent layers build upon each other to create new tones in unpredictable ways. And you begin to understand why so many artists clung to their palettes like talismans, refusing to change them once they found a combination that worked, even if it meant repeating the same flesh tone, the same robe color, over and over again. There's a story passed around among apprentices like a cautionary fable about a painter in Bologna who tried to impress a visiting bishop by mixing a brand new shade of purple, one he claimed was inspired by the robes of emperors. He layered it over an underpainting of green to give it depth, but failed to test how the two pigments would react over time. Within a month, the purple began to oxidize, the green beneath turned swampy, and the final effect was a bishop who appeared to be slowly decomposing. The painting was discreetly replaced. The painter fled to Venice, and nobody ever asked for imperial purple again. But it's not all failures and shame. These disasters, as frequent as they are, also form the slow, plodding backbone of color knowledge, of learning through failure, of discovering that a touch of lead white will soften a harsh vermilion, that a trace of Naples yellow can warm a cold green, that certain blues fade when exposed to candlelight. and must be protected beneath varnish. Every mishap adds to a personal catalogue of pigment behavior, a mental ledger of what not to do, and sometimes, by accident, even a new discovery. One of the workshop's favorite stories involves your master, a usually stern man whose laughter is rare and always slightly alarming, who once spilled a jar of burnt umber into a wet patch of egg tempera, meant for a saint's robe. Rather than cleaning it up, he smeared it with a cloth, and the resulting streak looked uncannily like a fold of fabric in shadow. He paused, considered it, and then painted around it, integrating the smear into the final piece. The robe, now lauded for its realistic draping, became a local marvel, and he's never told the patron the truth. Sometimes, he says, the brush knows better than the hand. Historians still argue whether Renaissance artists had access to a true color theory, or whether what we now teach as theory, warm versus cool, complementary contrast, simultaneous tones, was simply distilled from centuries of accidents like these. There are surviving notes and diagrams, to be sure, but much of what we assume they understood may in fact be the result of trial and error, slowly hardening into tradition. You sit now before your palette, watching the slow separation of oil from pigment in the small wooden well, where you've mixed a new skin tone. This time, a blend of Venetian red, white lead, and a whisper of yellow ochre. You've tested it on scrap panel, watched it dry, noted how it shifts under lamplight, and only now, with supreme caution, do you lift the brush to apply it to the cheek of your subject. It is a slow, deliberate act, and in your silence, you almost hear the voices of 1,000 artists before you, each whispering their own pigment secrets, their warnings, their petty grudges against colors that betrayed them. It's comforting, in a way, to know that perfection is not expected, that even masterpieces began with uncertainty and error, that beneath every famed painting lies a layer of hesitation, correction, maybe even regret, and so you embrace it. You scrape, mix, smear, adjust. You mutter oaths when the red goes orange. You sigh when the blue dries darker than expected. And every once in a while, by accident or grace, the colors align, and the painting breathes. As you stretch your back and gaze once more at the painting, slowly taking shape beneath your fingers, you realize that what the viewer will eventually see, the saintly face gazing toward the heavens, the gently draped folds of the robe, the soft halo blooming with faint gold leaf, is only the surface of a layered story, the final stage of a process that, like the growth of a tree, hides most of its development beneath the bark, invisible to all but the artist and time, because while the finished painting might seem spontaneous, even effortless, it is in truth a careful orchestration of layers, some deliberate, some revised, some forgotten, built up slowly over weeks or even months, and it's in those hidden strata that the true secrets of color and technique lie, waiting for centuries, perhaps, until the varnish cracks and restoration begins. You lean in close, remembering the panels you've seen X-rayed in your master's collection. Those blurry, spectral images, ghostly and pale, where saints looked in the wrong direction. Hands once reached toward objects no longer there, and entire angels hovered in places that, in the final painting, contain nothing but sky. These hidden layers, revealed by modern science but created by ancient uncertainty, tell stories not of divine inspiration, but of very human trial and error, changes in plan, in patron demand, in pigment availability, or simply in artistic preference. And they serve as reminders that even permanence is often born of adjustment. Take, for instance, the famous altarpiece in Santa Croce, the one visitors now travel hours to admire, believing every detail intentional, every hue preordained. What they don't see, and what only careful restoration has revealed, is that beneath the Madonna's cloak, once believed to be a masterful application of ultramarine, there lies an earlier robe, one of muted red lake, painted hastily, abandoned midway through. Historians still argue whether the artist changed the color for symbolic reasons, blue representing purity and heavenly grace, or whether the patron simply arrived with more money and demanded an upgrade to the more expensive pigment. Whatever the reason, the evidence of the shift remains, quiet and pale under the surface, like the faint impression of a forgotten dream. And these hidden layers are not limited to large changes. Sometimes, beneath the surface of a seemingly calm expression, restorers find an earlier version of the same face, slightly different. Eyebrows more arched, a smile more subdued or more generous. Traces of emotional experiments. Moments where the artist wavered between serenity and sorrow, between the divine and the recognizably human. It is, in a way, a glimpse into the painter's mind, a dialogue between what they intended and what they eventually accepted. And though it is invisible to the viewer, it is deeply intimate to the maker. You recall a panel you helped restore last spring, a modest Saint Jerome originally attributed to a minor Florentine master whose surface had yellowed and cracked with age, the reds fading toward rust, the blues sinking into greenish shadow. As the layers of varnish were removed, a previously unseen detail emerged. In the background, behind the saint's shoulder, a faint silhouette of a lion, his traditional companion, half erased, painted over with rock and shrub. No record exists of why it was removed. Perhaps the patron disliked the beast, or perhaps the artist deemed it too distracting. But there it was, quietly enduring under layers of concealment, waiting centuries for its outline to be traced once more by curious eyes and cautious hands. There's something oddly comforting about this. Not only that the past can be revealed, but that it was never truly gone, just sleeping beneath the visible, like roots under snow. The painting is never only what it seems. It is always the sum of its changes, its errors, its second thoughts. In that way, it is not unlike you. The techniques that create these layers are deceptively simple. First, a ground layer, usually gesso, white and smooth, followed by an underdrawing, often done with charcoal or metal point, mapping out the figures and major elements. Over that come the base colors, laid in flat and somewhat dull, meant only to establish zones of light and shade. Then come the glazes, thin, translucent layers of oil and pigment that shift tones subtly with each pass, deepening shadows, warming highlights, giving skin the illusion of translucence, of blood moving beneath the surface. Sometimes dozens of these glazes are applied, each barely altering the last, until the final color is not one pigment, but the echo of many. But these layers do more than build color. They build time. Each glaze must dry before the next is applied. Each mistake must be scraped and repainted. Each decision, whether to brighten a fold or darken an eye socket, takes days to manifest. And because of this, the painting becomes a calendar of your patience, your persistence, your thoughts across weeks or months, frozen not in stone, but in varnish and dust. You think, too, of the peculiar ways artists mark their work, not only with signatures, which were often forbidden in commissions of religious art, but with symbols, small hidden objects, or jokes left in the margins. A blue bottle fly on a windowsill, a single red thread trailing from a robe, a bird perched where no bird should be. Some of these were symbols known to patrons, others private jokes between master and apprentice. One legend tells of a painter who, annoyed at a patron's endless revisions, hid a tiny caricature of the man's face in the clouds above the Virgin's head. Unseen for centuries, until cleaning brought out the faint lines of a disapproving scowl nestled between cumulus forms. Historians still debate the meaning of these hidden images. Were they messages, accidents, amusements? Perhaps all three. Perhaps none. Perhaps, like the layers beneath the paint, they exist simply because the artist needed to say something the surface could not accommodate. It's worth remembering, too, that these hidden stories extend beyond the paintings themselves. The wood panels were often reused, scraped of earlier images, resized, flipped. X-rays sometimes reveal entire unrelated compositions lurking beneath the current image, suggesting a level of practicality that modern viewers might not expect from artists so often treated as visionaries. To them, a panel was a resource, not a relic, and if it could be used again, it was. You once worked on such a panel? A saint's portrait that, beneath its worn surface, held the remnants of a battlefield scene, swords raised, banners tattered. The contrast was striking, and you couldn't help but wonder whether the artist had known, whether that peaceful expression was painted in deliberate opposition to the chaos underneath. Or perhaps it was merely coincidence. But the thought stayed with you. And now as you return to your own panel, applying a final glaze to the folds of a robe, you find yourself thinking of what lies beneath, not only in pigment, but in purpose. The doubts you had in the early stages, the corrections you made, the moments you nearly abandoned the piece altogether. None of those moments are visible now, but they remain. They inform every brushstroke. They are as much a part of the painting as the color itself. So you step back, squint, consider the composition once more. It will not be perfect. No painting is. There will be flaws, subtle imbalances, perhaps even hidden regrets. But there will also be moments of quiet beauty, glazes that caught the light just right, tones that blended more smoothly than expected, and layers beneath the surface that carry the weight of your choices, your persistence, your care. And that, in the end, is what gives the painting its soul. You wake early the next morning, long before the sun has begun to filter through the narrow windows of the studio, and before the fires of the forges in the metalworkers' quarter begin to spit and roar and fill the air with their faint, smoky tang. And you move quietly through the workshop, past the sleeping tools and neatly arranged brushes, through the long corridor lined with framed commissions in various states of completion, and into the tiny chamber where the colors rest, where the raw pigments sleep in their pots and shells and bundles, waiting to be coaxed into vibrancy by your hands and your breath and a little oil. It is here in this small, sacred room filled with crushed stone, powdered bone, and sun-dried insects that the real work begins. Not the painting, not the polishing, not even the sketching of halos or drapery folds, but this quiet, early ritual of selection, of weighing, of remembering, of choosing which pieces of the earth, of plants, of creatures, will today become the blood in your painting's veins. You pass your fingers gently over the cool surface of a clamshell filled with cinnabar, the deep scarlet powder glinting faintly even in the dim morning light. A pigment whose intensity has seduced kings and clergy alike, and whose toxic edge whispers a reminder that beauty, especially in this line of work, sometimes demands a price paid not only in coin, but in health, in caution, in years gently shaved away by repeated exposure. Cinnabar, the mercurial red, born from the alchemy of sulfur and quicksilver, has long been prized and feared in equal measure. And though the Church has always loved the boldness it lends to martyr robes and sacred hearts, there is a part of you that hesitates each time you unstop the jar, as though waking a sleeping dragon. Nearby sits a paper packet of verdigris, that treacherous, verdant green made by exposing copper to vinegar vapors, whose initial vibrance fades with exposure, then darkens, then sometimes blooms with strange crystalline spots, a pigment so charming and so volatile that artists have historically debated whether it should ever be used at all, even while continuing to use it. Historians still argue whether the green cloak in certain portraits, so fresh in appearance for decades before blackening into shadow, was originally verdigris or merely a poorly mixed malachite substitute. The restorers with stronger opinions insist the mistakes are part of the medium's magic. You lift a small vial of azurite next, one of your favorites. Its deep blue-gray powder, not quite as luminous as lapis lazuli, not as prized by patrons who insist on celestial blues worthy of the Virgin's robe, but dependable in its own quiet way, stable under oil, friendly to mixtures, and forgiving when applied with patience. You recall with a half smile the time your master asked you to glaze a sky using nothing but azurite. No lead white, no trick of grisaille, just pure layering, and how, over many days and many thin strokes, it deepened into a dusk that still makes you proud when you pass it on the studio wall. And then, beside it, the real prize, lapis lazuli, or more precisely, the coarse blue rock from which the treasured ultramarine is ground. A stone that has traveled all the way from the mines of Badakhshan, in what modern maps call Afghanistan. Though to you and your fellows, it's simply from the east, that hazy realm of merchants and camel trains and endless sun. The stone is expensive, hideously so, traded by weight and sometimes cut with cheaper minerals by unscrupulous sellers. But when ground properly, purified, and mixed with oil or egg yolk, it yields a blue so rich, so full of light, that no substitute can ever truly match it. It is the blue of miracles, of the heavens, of the infinite cloaks of the divine. And it is, quite literally, worth more than gold. Mixing it, however, is a trial. You must first wash and grind the stone into fine powder, then knead it in a paste made from wax, pine resin, and lye, a sticky mess that must be soaked and massaged over and over until the pigment begins to release from the binding medium in faint blue streams, like mist, bleeding into water. The process takes hours, sometimes days, and yields only a tiny amount of the purest ultramarine, with the remaining bulk reserved for lower grades, what your master dismissively calls mule blue. You use this pure pigment sparingly, always with reverence, always with the knowledge that its cost must be justified in the eyes of the patron, or else hidden beneath other layers, never to be seen. You've heard stories, likely apocryphal, of artists bankrupting themselves for a handful of the stone, of smuggling it wrapped in linen and hidden in loaves of bread, of apprentices who were caught stealing a pinch and punished not with the lash, but with public humiliation, made to clean every mortar in the shop for a year. True or not, these tales serve a purpose. They remind you, and every painter who handles it, that color is not merely vision. It is economy, geography, politics, and danger. And that danger extends beyond the obvious. Orpiment, for example, a golden yellow with a buttery luster and a subtle warmth that sings when placed beside deep blues or fresh reds, is made of arsenic sulfide. It glows like treasure, but it kills like poison. It can cause ulcers on the skin, inflammation of the lungs, and worse if ingested or inhaled too freely. And yet, artists use it. They always have. Carefully, respectfully, but persistently. Because it is beautiful. Because nothing else does quite the same thing. There's a quiet, unspoken bravery in this, you think, in knowing that your materials can harm you, not metaphorically, but quite literally, and yet using them anyway. Because the art demands it. Not for vanity, not for fame, but because the painting needs that glow, that shimmer, that kiss of divine color, and because you, like the masters before you, have accepted that some parts of creation require risk. Even the so-called safe pigments have their quirks. Lead white, the most common of all whites, the very foundation of so much skin tone and light, is made by suspending lead in vinegar and letting it corrode over days in tightly sealed clay pots, a process both foul in scent and delicate in practice. Its opacity and warmth make it invaluable. But over time, lead white can blacken under the wrong conditions, reacting with sulfur in the air or impurities in the binder. You remember one panel meant to depict Saint Cecilia, where her face, once radiant, turned a dull gray after just 2 years in the sacristy, likely from nearby incense. The restorer did what he could, but even now, she looks faintly spectral, like a memory fading. You brush these memories aside and begin preparing your mixes for the day, grinding with the muller, slowly adding oil drop by drop, watching as the powders begin to transform into buttery paint, thick and luscious, clinging to the palette with a satisfying weight. You test a stroke or two, adjusting the ratio, warming the tone, shifting it just so. It is a quiet labor, repetitive and grounding, a dance of hand and wrist and eye, performed in silence but with great intention. And as the morning light finally breaks through the studio's high windows, you feel ready, not just to paint, but to remember, to honor the hands that first ground lapis in Mesopotamian basins, the monks who catalogued hues in the margins of illuminated manuscripts, the women who plucked cochineal beetles from cactus paddles in the highlands of Mexico, unaware their harvest would end up in European crimson capes and painted cardinals. To remember that every color has a lineage, a journey, a transformation, from stone, from bug, from flame, to the surface of your panel. And that, in your own small way, you are now part of that lineage. One more hand in a chain of hands, one more quiet breath among centuries of color, whispering across the paint. You find yourself pausing in front of a painting that you've walked past many times before without giving it much thought. Just another devotional panel tucked into the side of a chapel, one of dozens that line the walls, half hidden behind flickering candles and the velvet roping that discourages close inspection. And today, for reasons you can't quite explain, you stop. Your eyes slowly adjusting to the dim light, your fingers idly tracing the pattern of the tiled floor beneath your feet, as you take in the work, not as a completed image, but as a layered testimony to the choices and struggles of the artist who brought it into being, whose name may be half forgotten, whose signature may be buried under years of overpainting or varnish, and whose techniques still whisper through the cracks and pigments, if you're willing to listen closely enough. What strikes you first isn't the subject, which is familiar. Another St. Catherine, wheel tucked behind her like a shadow, palm frond delicately balanced between two fingers. But the background, a deep and haunting blue that glows despite the dust, despite the grime of centuries, despite the dull yellowing that the varnish has begun to exhibit at the edges of the frame. It's the kind of blue that only comes from one source, the kind of blue that makes restorers and pigment historians lean in with quiet reverence, the kind of blue that once cost more than gold and had to be weighed out in secret behind locked cabinets. The unmistakable presence of true ultramarine. And it's here, in this moment, that your thoughts shift, not just to the pigment itself, but to the people who handled it, who bought it, who taxed it, who smuggled it, who scraped it from the hills of Afghanistan and ground it into fine powder with aching wrists and blindfolded ambition. Lapis lazuli was not just a stone. It was a currency, a symbol, a trade route anchor, a geopolitical player wrapped up in silk and carried across deserts on the backs of camels, passed through hands that knew nothing of painting, but everything of survival. You think about how, during the height of the Renaissance, entire inventories of artists' studios were recorded not by the paintings themselves, many of which were unsigned or unattributed, but by the pigments stored on the premises, as if the true value of the space lay not in what had been created, but in what might yet be possible. A studio with a single ounce of ultramarine was elevated in status, seen as a place of prestige, a place where serious commissions could be executed, and where patrons might trust that their money would be translated into the proper shades of sky and sainthood. But it wasn't just lapis that carried that weight. Cochineal, harvested from insects on prickly pear cactus pads in the high plains of the New World, was another treasure, a blood-rich crimson that stunned European markets with its vibrancy and permanence. When it arrived on Spanish ships in the 16th century, It disrupted not only the dye industry, but the world of painting, offering an alternative to the less stable madder lake and the ever-volatile carmine. Painters who could afford it found in cochineal a new way to render cardinals' robes, martyr wounds, even the flushed cheeks of infants with a subtlety and permanence that had previously eluded them. And as with lapis, its journey was fraught with complexity. Cochineal was measured and controlled, taxed by crown authorities, used as diplomatic currency, and even traded among pirates. There are records of entire cargoes being ransomed, not for their spices or silver, but for their tightly packed barrels of dried insects, their weight equivalent in value to silk or even sugar. Historians still argue whether cochineal's introduction changed the color hierarchy of European art, or merely replaced one rarity with another. But there's no denying that its impact was immediate and profound. Its legacy is still traceable in the robes of painted saints and the hem of the Virgin's dress. As you stare at the painting's background, you begin to wonder how many decisions in art were made not for aesthetic reasons, but for economic ones. How many green robes are green simply because there wasn't enough blue to go around? How many golden halos were left ungilded, not out of humility, but out of necessity? How many saints' expressions are serene not because the artist wished them to be, but because the patron had paid for only 2 weeks' labor and not a moment more? Even the very size of a canvas was negotiable. Larger panels meant more wood, more pigment, more labor. And so, some artists sketched in grandeur, then scaled back in woodshop reality, trimming saints' gestures, flattening backgrounds, shrinking the breadth of heaven itself until it fit within a price tag. You think of Vasari's notes, those gossipy little asides in his Lives of the Artists, where he mentions not only the talent of his subjects, but their cunning in negotiation, their capacity to flatter, to delay, to promise divine color, and deliver earthly compromise. You smile at that, not cynically, but knowingly, because art, at least as practiced in the Renaissance, was never purely about vision. It was about trade, diplomacy, materials, time, and above all, balance. Balancing expense against impression, symbolism against technique, surface beauty against deeper durability. And nowhere is that balance clearer than in the choice of binders. A pigment, after all, is only potential. It becomes a usable color only when bound with a medium. Whether egg yolk in tempera, linseed oil in the Flemish tradition, or casein, or gum arabic, or even saliva in desperate monastic scriptoriums. Each binder has its strengths and weaknesses, its drying times and opacity levels, its sheen and smell. A pigment that sings in oil might dull in tempera. A red that glows in egg might sink into wax like a tired flame. You think of the trials faced by traveling painters who had to adjust their technique based on what they could carry. Those who packed powdered pigments in stitched leather rolls, who used beer or wine as impromptu binders, who bartered for egg yolks in unfamiliar villages, while their apprentices prepared panels in borrowed barns. Every color we now see, sealed under centuries of varnish, once began as a chaotic mixture of practicality, preference, and chance. And this extends even to the framing. Some patrons insisted on heavy gilded frames carved with angels and floral motifs, Others preferred sober walnut or dark oak, depending on their theological leanings or the current trends in Florence or Venice or Bruges. The frame was not just decorative, it was a declaration of intent, a border not only of space, but of meaning. In some cases, painters designed the frames themselves, integrating them into the visual logic of the work, turning corners into thrones and curves into curtains. As you turn to leave the chapel, the sound of distant bells echoing softly across the tiled floor. You pause once more to glance at St. Catherine's wheel, so often symbolic of her martyrdom, so often rendered hastily, as though the painter resented the reminder of violence in an otherwise serene composition. And here, in this version, you notice something different. The wheel is not sharp, not terrifying, but softened, almost hidden in shadow. Its spikes dulled, its form barely outlined. It is a subtle act of mercy. Perhaps the artist, weary of so much suffering, chose to obscure the torment. Perhaps the patron requested a gentler rendering. Or perhaps the pigment simply faded. The grey charcoal washed out by time and air. But in that choice, or accident, you see the painter's humanity. The layers of decisions, the push and pull of history and hand, money and meaning aren't an accident. And it reminds you, once again, that behind every painting is a person. Not a genius suspended in divine inspiration, but a worker, a dreamer, a negotiator, a chemist, a traveler, a little bit tired, a little bit stubborn, who stood where you now stand, holding a brush in one hand and a hope in the other. You're back in the studio now, not just physically, but mentally. And as the daylight softens through the high windows and spills onto the wooden floors, where pigment dust sometimes gathers in sleepy piles, you move with the kind of careful deliberation that only comes at the end of a long, thoughtful journey. Your brush in hand, not as a weapon or a wand, but as something humbler, gentler, something worn smooth by repetition, by trial, by years of learning when to press and when to pause, when to let the pigment speak, and when to coax it into saying something new. There's a panel before you, freshly gessoed, just the right size, square corners sanded down slightly to avoid splintering, the kind of surface that seems to whisper in expectation. And though you could sketch the outlines of a saint or a scholar or a silent Madonna, you hesitate, not out of fear, but out of a quiet recognition that what you're about to do is not merely decoration, not just an exercise in form or beauty or even piety, but a kind of alchemy, a weaving of elements as old as the hills and as fragile as a sigh. You begin by preparing the underdrawing, tracing faint lines with a silver point stylus that barely leaves a mark on the white ground unless you tilt your head just right. A technique that artists across centuries have used not because it's easy, it isn't, but because it forces you to commit, to see your mistakes as part of the foundation rather than something to be hidden. And as the forms emerge, not fully human yet, but pregnant with potential, you reach again for your pigments, laid out in careful rows, like little nations waiting to be called upon, each with their own history, their own needs, their own secrets. You start with lead white, mixing it with oil until it reaches that consistency of cold butter. Not too loose, not too stiff, perfect for highlights and base tones. Then a little ochre, earthy and warm for the underpainting of skin, the shadows around the nose and beneath the fingers. Those places where light will eventually bloom. As you work, you hum quietly. Not a song, really, but something between breath and rhythm. A way to measure the strokes, to pace the drying time, to keep yourself anchored in this slow, ancient task that generations of artists have known intimately. It's funny, you think, how so much of painting, especially in this Renaissance style that you've come to know like the grain of your own skin, is about control and surrender at once. You plan, you measure, you mix with precision, but once the brush touches the panel, once the oil begins to interact with the surface and the ambient air, once the color begins to dry at its own pace or shift ever so slightly with exposure, you must let go of part of it, must trust that what you've done will hold, and that what slips beyond your reach will at least do so gracefully. You work for hours, layering shadows, glazes, transparent veils of ultramarine that take days to dry, but reward patience with an almost musical depth, like standing at the edge of a deep pool and watching the light filter down into its center. You paint folds of cloth with such care that even you are surprised by how they seem to ripple slightly when you tilt your head. And the eyes, always the eyes, are last, because they are the most dangerous, the most sacred, the place where a painting either awakens or slumbers forever. You think briefly of the artists who came before, of Fra Angelico, who prayed before every stroke, of Van Eyck, whose precision in oil turned portraits into echoes of eternity, of Artemisia Gentileschi, whose tenacity burned through every pigment she touched. And you wonder, not for the first time, if they felt the same sense of stillness, the same soft fear, the same impossible joy when they finished a work, when they stepped back and saw, not perfection, but something undeniably human and whole. And this, you realize, is where the story ends, not with a final masterpiece, not with a dramatic flourish of the brush or a standing ovation from a wealthy patron, but with this quiet moment of exhalation, of stepping away from the easel and wiping your hands on a rag, of looking at what you've made and knowing that, for all its imperfections and accidents and compromises, it carries within it the dust of mountains, the shells of beetles, the ashes of burnt bones, the sweat of laborers, the breath of the artist, and maybe, just maybe, the lingering touch of something divine. Because this whole strange, beautiful, exhausting, meticulous process of mixing colors from rocks and bugs and metals and plants and blood and dreams is not just history. It's ritual. It's memory. It's proof that somewhere along the line, someone thought that turning powder into light was a worthwhile way to spend a life. And maybe, just maybe, they were right. So now, as the pigments settle back into their jars, and the brushes are rinsed and laid to dry, and the studio fades into that late evening hush when everything seems softer, gentler, more forgiving, you let yourself drift. The colors you've conjured, those fragile blues and dangerous reds, those yellows that glowed too brightly to trust, those greens that curled like secrets in the corners of the painting, still echo faintly behind your eyelids, not as tools or elements, but as companions. as if each pigment had a voice and a name and a lullaby of its own. The smell of oil and wood and dust lingers faintly in the air, a scent that clings to your fingers even after you've washed them. The way stories linger long after the telling, and you find yourself humming again. Something ancient and tuneless, the same melody that echoed off monastery walls and through Venetian workshops and under the breath of Florentine apprentices working late by candlelight, just like you. There is no rush now. No more panels to prime or pigments to grind or gold leaf to burnish. There is only the slow, steady unraveling of thought into rest. The sense that you've stepped not just through history, but into it. That you've touched, however lightly, the lives of those who saw color, not as decoration, but as language, as music, as prayer. And so, with one final breath, you lay your tools aside and let your thoughts become quiet. Let the colors fade. Let the silence deepen. Let yourself drift